Hey friends, about 70% of folks watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, after 2 months on the job, doubts have started creeping in, especially as the warm glow of autumn fades and winter's chill approaches. The solitude that at first seemed peaceful has taken on a sinister tone. Strange sounds echo through the woods at night, snapping branches rustling underbrush, animals screeching in the distance. At least I hope they're animals. But it's the bizarre stories and bits of folklore shared by the locals in the tiny gateway town that have me tossing and turning in my bunk at night, jumping at every creak of the old cabin. Morning, Sam. Coffee. Walt, the gray-bearded senior ranger, called out as I stomped into the ranger station. The chipped green mug he extended was nearly obscured by the steam wafting up from it. You're a lifesaver, Walt, I replied gratefully, wrapping my chilled fingers around the mug. The coffee was scalding and had an astringent bite, but the warmth spreading through my core was worth the taste. I shrugged off my down jacket and glanced out the station window at the churning dark clouds. It would be a cold one today. Quite a storm blowing in, Walt observed, following my gaze. They're crying for a foot of snow in the upper elevations. I grimaced, dreading the idea of hiking through knee-deep drifts, but sudden snowstorms were a reality this time of year that rangers had to be prepared for. Hello, friend. About 70% of the viewers who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. From which country or city do you follow this channel? The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I hiked along the winding trail. Fallen leaves were crunching beneath my boots. Matte in gold hues painted the towering maples that canopied over me. I had taken this job as a park ranger a few months ago, partly to get away from the stresses and distractions back home in Milwaukee. The monotony of my accounting job, combined with the mountain of credit card debt and student loans, had left me feeling trapped and desperate for a change of scenery. When I saw the posting for a ranger position in the remote Allegheny National Forest of Pennsylvania, something in me leapt at the chance to escape into nature, to simplify my life and reset my priorities. The pay was meager, but they provided rustic cabin housing and my living expenses would be covered. I figured that a few years in the wilderness, living simply and paying down debt, was just what I needed. I had camped and hiked in Wisconsin state parks growing up, so living in the forest didn't intimidate me. Or so I thought. Oh, before you head out, a woman from town stopped by early this morning, said her husband and his buddy went hunting yesterday up near Hell's Hollow and never returned to their truck. Probably just holed up in their tent and rode out the snow. But keep an eye out, will ya? I tensed at the mention of Hell's Hollow, remembering the eerie stories I'd overheard at the town diner. Tales of ghostly figures glimpsed weaving through the aspen groves, haunting shrieks piercing the night, sending campers fleeing to their vehicles. Hell's Hollow. Is that a common spot for hunters? I asked with forced casualness. Walt met my eyes, and I detected a flicker of unease before he replaced it with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's a fine spot. Good elk grazing meadow at the base of the hollow. I'm sure those fellas just got caught in the snow, but bad weather brings out strange things sometimes. Just be careful out there, Sam. With those cryptic words ringing in my head, I zipped my jacket, shouldered my pack, and headed out into the swirling white. The snowfall quickly obscured the trail as I climbed in elevation, following the winding path towards Hell's Hollow. The forest was preternaturally still sound, muffled by the thickening white blanket. Only the crunch of my snowshoes and the rasp of my breath broke the heavy silence. An involuntary shudder rippled through me, only partially due to the plummeting temperature. Walt's parting words kept echoing in my head. What did he mean? That bad weather brings out strange things? I shook myself, trying to dislodge the tendrils of unease. I was a ranger. I reminded myself sternly. My job was to ensure the safety of park visitors, not indulge in paranoid fantasies. After 2 hours of slogging through deepening drifts, I finally reached the rim of Hell's Hollow. Staring down into the mist-filled bowl of forest, I understood how it had gotten its foreboding name. Skeletal aspens clawed at the leaden sky, their pale bark a ghostly contrast to the blacks and grays of the evergreens. No birds called, no squirrels chattered or skittered. An eerie pall hung over the hollow. I scanned the perimeter looking for signs of the missing hunter's camp. After a few minutes, I spotted a flash of fluorescent orange through the trees. A tent rainfly. I unshouldered my pack and retrieved my radio. Ranger Station. This is Sam over. I released the button, anticipating the comforting crackle of Walt's voice, but only static hissed from the speakers. I tried again. Ranger Station. This is Sam. I've located what I believe to be the missing hunter's campsite over more static. A tendril of unease snaked up my spine. Hell's Hollow was remote, but I'd never had trouble with radio reception before. Reclipping the radio to my belt, I trudged down the slope towards the tent. As I approached, dread pooled in my gut. The tent had completely collapsed, its tattered rainfly flapping like a leaf in the gusting wind. But what made my heart lurch to a stop were the crimson streaks painting the ripped nylon and the surrounding snow. With a trembling hand, I drew my pistol and crept towards the ruined tent. I had to check for bodies, though. I already sensed I wouldn't find the hunters inside. The bloodstains told a grim story. Steeling myself, I used the barrel of my gun to flick back the fly. A strangled gasp escaped me, and I stumbled back, my stomach heaving. The interior of the tent was drenched in blood. Shredded sleeping bags and torn bits of clothing littered the floor. But the most horrifying sight was the wreckage of bones, glistening crimson and gnawed, clean of all flesh. Hands shaking, I lurched back from the gory scene, barely making it a few steps before dropping to my knees and retching into the snow. Crime scene training had not prepared me for this. What could have done this? What creature could have torn two grown men limb from limb and devoured them like that? Bears. My mind immediately leapt to the idea of a rogue grizzly that hadn't gone to ground for the winter. They were rare in this part of the Alleghenies, but not unheard of. But something in my gut told me this savagery was not the work of any bear. Fighting back a surge of panic, I staggered to my feet. Protocol dictated that I secure the scene and await backup. But without radio contact, backup wasn't coming anytime soon. A gust of wind knifed across the hollow, sending dry leaves skittering. The forest felt expectant, watchful. I had to get out of here. The snowstorm had obliterated my tracks, but I still had my compass. I oriented myself northward back toward the ranger station and began marching at the fastest clip I could manage in the deepening snow. The forest closed in around me, skeletal branches grasping at my clothing. After 15 minutes of panicked hiking, a break in the trees revealed a disturbing sight. The hollow stretched before me, the bloody remains of the tent, a macabre centerpiece. It was impossible. I'd been hiking directly away from the campsite, and yet somehow I'd looped right back to where I'd started. Icy tendrils of fear crept up my spine as I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the perimeter of the hollow. Dark gray clouds roiled overhead, spitting icy pellets that stung my face and eyes. In the diffuse light, the trees all looked the same, offering no clue as to which direction I'd come from. A soft crack like the snapping of a twig sounded from the tree line to my left. I rolled around, fumbling to unholster my pistol with numb fingers. At first, I saw nothing. Then, about 30 yards away, A dark shape detached from the shadows of a large spruce. It was the size of a large man, but it moved with an inhuman gait, sometimes loping on all fours and other times rising up to a hunched bipedal stance. Matted fur, the color of a moonless night, covered its body, and its eyes, dear God. Its eyes glowed with a spectral phosphorescent green I've only seen in deep ocean fish. This was no bear. This was something straight out of a primordial nightmare. Those terrifying eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the air leave my lungs, as if I'd been punched in the gut. Raw naked, hunger radiated from that gaze, freezing me in place. Some vestigial instinct finally unfroze my paralyzed limbs, and I broke into a stumbling run, unsure of where I was going, only knowing I had to get away from the creature stalking me from the shadows. Branches whooped my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature lurked along behind me, toying with me, a ravening wolf playing with a rabbit before sinking its teeth in. The snow made finding stable footing nearly impossible. Again and again I lost my balance and went sprawling, clawing my way back to my feet with increasing desperation. Blood roared in my ears and dark spots crowded the edges of my vision. How long could I keep this up? How long before exhaustion and the elements felled me as surely as the foul thing in the shadows? The creature uttered a piercing howl that sent icy claws raking down my spine. It was done with our game. I could hear its stealthy approach through the trees off to my right, effortlessly gliding across the terrain that had me floundering. I needed a miracle. The ranger station was still miles away. My strength was flagging my coordination shot. If by some dark miracle I even made it back to the rim of Hell's Hollow, I was utterly disoriented. I had no idea which direction to go. Dimly, I realized I was still clutching my pistol in one white-knuckled hand. Some good that would do me against a preternatural creature of the forest. But perhaps it was my ticket out of a far more grisly end. My toe caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, my face plowing into a snowbank. Sputtering, I rolled over onto my back just as a dark shape burst from the trees. The creature stalked forward, its legs bizarrely elongated, its eyes flaring with triumphant hunger. I scrabbled backwards until my shoulders hit the unyielding trunk of a massive oak. Please, I heard myself whimper. Please. The creature made a sound halfway between a growl and a dark chuckle as it loomed over me. This close, I could see its matted fur was slick with old blood and viscera, the same blood and viscera that had painted the inside of the hunter's tent. My guards rose and I fought the urge to vomit. Why? I croaked through my burning throat. I didn't expect an answer. What answer could there be? To my shock, the thing spoke in a guttural rasp in a language I had never heard before. And yet, I understood it perfectly. Should not have come, you should not have trespassed, you should not have looked. Now you are mine, little mouse. Now you will feed the forest. It crouched down, coiled to spring. Its lips peeled back in a demented grin, revealing dagger-like yellow teeth. Time seemed to slow. My life didn't flash before my eyes. Only stark, icy terror gripped me. My fingers tightened convulsively around my gun. I lifted it slowly, not to aim at the advancing horror, but to press the cold muzzle against my own temple. Better a quick death than to be devoured alive. I squeezed my eyes shut. The creature roared. A gunshot split the air, but it wasn't my pistol that had fired. My eyes flew open in shock. The creature was doubled over, black ichor spurting from a gaping wound in its abdomen. An inhuman shriek of pain and rage ripped from its throat. I stared wildly around, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Through the trees, I could make out a human form trudging through the snow, a hunting rifle held at the ready. Get away from him, you filthy bastard, a reedy male voice cried out. The creature whirled to face the new threat. Fangs bared in a vicious snarl. I recognized the man stumbling into the clearing, Hank Greer, one of the old-timers from town. He was still wearing his faded flannel and suspenders rather than winter outerwear. "Ranger, you okay?" Hank called, never taking his eyes off the creature. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. The creature crouched low, preparing to spring at the old man. "Hank, watch out!" I finally managed to rouse, but Hank stood his ground, raising the rifle to his shoulder. The creature pounced, becoming a blur of shadows and teeth. Hank squeezed the trigger. The report of the rifle was deafening. The creature's momentum carried it forward and straight onto the muzzle of Hank's gun. Black blood sprayed across the snow as the bullet found its mark. With an agonized howl, the creature crumpled to the ground, its limbs twitching spasmodically. Hank took a measured step forward and pumped 2 more rounds into the thing's skull. Bone shards and gore splattered the pristine snow. I sat there stunned and immobile as silence returned to the forest. Hank turned to me, his weathered face etched with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. "You're one lucky son of a gun," he said, extending a hand to help me up. I took it numbly, struggling to my feet. "How? What?" I sputtered, my gaze fixed on the steaming ruin of the creature in the snow. Hank sighed, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. That my unfortunate friend was a Wendigo. Damn thing has been plaguing this forest for the better part of a century. Wendigo. I repeated dumbly. Those are just a Native American legend, aren't they? Hank fixed me with his piercing blue eyes. They're a legend, alright? But the kind of legend that's got more than a kernel of truth to it. The Wendigo is a creature of hunger, Ranger. Hunger for human flesh. It takes over a man who's succumbed to cannibalism. See, twist him into an abomination. The image of the blood-sucked tent, the gnawed bones flashed behind my eyes and my stomach lurched. So those hunters fell victim to it. Yeah, probably got trapped out here in the storm, ran out of food. One of them got desperate, turned on his buddy, and the Wendigo claimed him. I retrieved my fallen pistol with a trembling hand, swaying slightly on my feet. My whole world had just been upended. Monsters were real. They hunted in the shadows of the very forest I'd sworn to protect. We need to call this in. We need to warn people, close the trails. But even as I said it, I knew how futile that course of action was. Who would believe us? Hank shook his head grimly. Won't do no good. The Wendigo ain't the only dark thing in these woods. A shiver rippled through me that had little to do with the icy wind. What do you mean? You're on its radar now, son. You looked into its eyes. They might be coming for you. Hank turned and began trudging back the way he'd come. I stared after him in disbelief. Well, you can just leave me with that. What am I supposed to do? Same thing I did. Hank replied without stopping or turning around. You find yourself a decent rifle and you start learning the old ways to protect yourself. 'Cause this Ranger Robinson, this is just the beginning. His grizzled head disappeared into the swirling white. The wind keened through the trees like a funeral dirge. I stood there as the shadows lengthened and snow began to fall in earnest. My old life had ended in this hollow. Now I knew my true purpose, my penance for trespassing in this ancient, cursed place. I had to stay and fight the darkness that lurked here, because no one else could. The walk back to the ranger station took hours, each step heavier than the last as the adrenaline drained away and the true horror of what I'd witnessed sank in. The Wendigo, a creature out of myth and nightmare, was real. It had torn those men apart, and now, according to Hank, it would be hunting me. Walt paled when I stumbled through the cabin door and relayed, in halting, shaking words, what had happened out in the hollow. He silently opened the gun safe and withdrew an old rifle, its wooden stock carved with unfamiliar symbols. Pressing it into my numb hands, he explained that it had been passed down through generations of rangers. Silver bullets and warning signs, he said grimly, they're the only things that will slow the Wendigo down. Hank will teach you the old ways, the rituals and invocations to protect yourself, because it's coming. Sam, you're a marked man now. The days blurred together as I threw myself into learning this strange and terrifying new craft under Hank's gruff tutelage. I carved protective symbols into the door frames and windowsills of my cabin, hung charms of bone and herbs, memorized the syllables of ancient Algonquin chants until my throat was raw. All the while the sense of being watched, being hunted grew. Shadows seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of my vision. The wind carried snatches of grotesque, guttural voices. Sleep became a rare and fitful thing, haunted by glowing eyes and bloody fangs. It was almost a relief when the Wendigo finally came on a night of screeching wind and driving snow. I heard its howls echoing through the trees and knew it was time to face the beast that had marked me. I stepped out into the snowstorm, my rifle heavy in my hands, the shamanic charms clinking softly where they hung around my neck. All my fear, all my horror and revulsion had burned away, replaced by a cold, implacable resolve. This was my duty, now my curse and calling. Wendigo loomed out of the swirling white, its eyes blazing with malevolent hunger. I whispered words of warning and the protective symbols on my cabin flared to life, forcing the creature back with a furious shriek. You should not have come, I said, my voice steely and strange in my own ears. I am the guardian of this forest, and I will not let you take one more innocent life from me. We clashed there in the howling dark. The Wendigo's claws raked my flesh even as my silver bullets pierced its foul hide. Blood, both black and red, painted the snow. The creature was immensely strong, but I had the power of old magics on my side. As dawn lightened the sky, I stood over the twice-dead corpse of the Wendigo, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body a map of wounds. But I was alive. I had won this time. I burned the body there in the hollow, scattering the ashes in a ritual of cleansing. But I knew my battle was far from over. All told me that there would always be more monsters drawn to prowl the shadows of these ancient trees, and I would be waiting for them. The ranger who walks between the worlds of light and darkness. A trespasser no more, but a sworn guardian, a keeper of the balance. My name is Sam Robinson. I used to be an accountant. Now I am the one who stalks the stalkers in the night. The one who hunts the hunters. I am a ranger and the forest is under my protection. The worst part of being a search and rescue officer in the Harcourt Forest wasn't the isolation, as I once thought. The long stretches alone in the wilderness with minimal human interaction were actually peaceful in their own way. The thick canopy muffling the world above, the ever-present chatter of birds and rustle of creatures in the underbrush. There was a certain tranquility to it all. No, the true nightmare began with my last operation. It shattered any illusion of serenity these woods once held for me. My name is Randall Elser, and after over a decade with the United States Forest Service, I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. That fateful morning, the call came in just as the rising sun was threading its first probing rays through the misty boughs. 2 college students, Ella and Lucas, had failed to check in with their parents after a hiking trip. Worry had turned to dread overnight. I gathered my gear with the usual systematic efficiency, but an unfamiliar heaviness weighted my movements. Call it intuition, or maybe just the bleak aura of the dank morning, but something felt off from the start. The drive to the trailhead was shrouded in an eerie silence. Mist drifting across the road like ghostly fingers. The car, a weathered Subaru, sat alone in the gravel lot. The sight of it so singularly isolated sent a chill skittering up my spine, despite the muggy air. I noted the plate number and tightened the straps of my pack, as if the act could provide some mental steadiness. With a deep breath of loamy air, I stepped onto the trail, dense foliage swallowing me in seconds. The path they forged was easy to follow initially. Slapped twigs trampled undergrowth, the occasional scrap of granola bar wrapper, all sure signs of inexperienced hikers. City kids, lured by romantic stories of nature's charms, so often underestimate her power. An hour in, I reached a small clearing, and the first true stab of unease pierced my gut. The air here felt different, thicker, like inhaling the simmering fumes from a witch's cauldron. In the center, the remains of a campfire, smoldered tendrils of smoke still curling from the charred logs. It couldn't have been dead for long. Nearby, 2 backpacks lay haphazardly, their contents scattered as if rifled through in haste or panic. An all too familiar dread began to coalesce in my chest, but I pushed it down. Now was a time for focus, not fear. The forest swallowed my voice. No echo returned. Only the mocking caw of a crow broke the heavy silence that followed. A clammy sweat prickled my neck, despite the chill. I plunged deeper into the trees, following the increasingly erratic trail, and unease solidified into potent fear with every step. The GPS confirmed my suspicion. We were venturing into a largely uncharted quadrant of the forest, one where few dared tread. Each rustle of leaves now seemed sinister. Each shadow thrown by gnarled branches was a looming threat. The feeling of unseen eyes boring into my back became almost unbearable. Then I stumbled into a scene that would forever sear itself into my darkest memories. The forest floor was a scene of chaos, large swaths of earth brutally uprooted as if by a monstrous hand. Among the clumps of dirt lay shreds of fabric smeared with an unmistakable crimson. My heartbeat roared in my ears. The creature attack would have been a mercy compared to the dreadful truth before me now. Then I saw him, or rather the broken, mangled thing that had once been Lucas. Limbs bent at sickening angles, flesh shredded. But worst of all were his eyes, wide and glassy, the terror of his final moments frozen in perpetuity. In that moment alone, with the eviscerating truth of Lucas' fate, I first tasted the true terror that lurked in Harcourt's depths, a terror that I would soon come to know far more intimately than I ever dared fear. But in that grim clearing, one thought pounded through the shock and horror storming my mind. I had to find Ella before it was too late. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling as it tried to process the nightmarish scene before me. Lucas' lifeless eyes bored into me, searing an indelible brand of failure into my soul. But a sudden crackle from my radio jolted me back to the grim urgency of the moment. Fingers shaking, I fumbled for the receiver, praying for the sane anchor of a human voice on the other end. Static hissed and spat, a mocking reflection of the thoughts churning in my head. I managed to croak out a garbled call for backup before the signal guttered out completely. The heavy silence that followed was an oppressive shroud. I was alone, just me, the butchered remains of a young man, and whatever nightmare had wreaked this carnage. A sudden chill rippled down my spine, scattering clammy droplets of doubt. Was I the hunter or the hunted in this grim tale? Steeling myself, I turned my attention to the gruesome trail leading deeper into the forest's heart. Smears of blood and churned earth formed a macabre path, a breadcrumb trail to an unspeakable destination. With leaden feet and a hammering heart, I forced myself to follow. The trees seemed to press closer with each step, their canopy knotting together to blot out the sun's feeble attempts at penetrating the gloom. The air grew thick and fetid, curdling in my lungs. Death's perfume hung heavy here. Shadows twisted and leapt in the strobing beam of my flashlight. Each yawning pool of darkness was a potential adversary. Then a flash of movement ahead froze the blood in my veins. A shape crouched in the underbrush, a grotesque silhouette that defied natural laws. Limbs too long, angles too sharp, a parody of the human form. It was hunched over something, That was similar. I all scalded the back of my throat as realization crashed over me in a sickening wave. The creature was feeding. A strangled gasp escaped me before I could choke it back. The thing's head snapped up, fathomless eyes locked onto mine with a predator's intensity. In that suspended moment, I knew with crystalline clarity that I was staring into the face of pure primal evil. Then it screamed, a piercing, soul-shredding wail that clawed at the very fabric of sanity. In a blur of unnatural speed, it lunged. Survival instinct jolted through me like a lightning strike. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth with the reckless terror of a hunted animal. Branches clawed at my face, roots grasped at my ankles, but I hardly felt them. All that existed was the primal need to escape, to outrun the horror snapping at my heels. My flashlight beam danced wildly, strobing glimpses of nightmare made real. The creature was fast, far faster than anything natural had a right to be. I could hear its rasping breath, feel the heat of its hunger. Then, in a moment of sheer heart-stopping dread, my foot caught on a gnarled root. The forest floor rushed up to meet me in a dizzying swirl of mulch and shadow. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the ground hard, the flashlight tumbling from my grasp to be swallowed by the darkness. Winded and dazed, I scrambled to my feet in panic, a living thing clawing at my throat. The creature's screams were getting closer, a banshee's call heralding my own demise. But then a miracle. Through the strobing black, I caught a glimpse of a structure. A small cabin, windows, dark and sightless, but utterly welcome in its solid humanity. With a last burst of desperate energy, I sprinted for the cabin, stumbling up the creaking steps and crashing through the door just as a heavy weight slammed into it from the other side. Trembling violently, I rammed the bolt home. The creature's shrieks of rage muffled but no less terrifying. In the suffocating darkness of the cabin, I slumped to the floor, gasping for air and trying to still the jackhammer pounding of my heart. I was safe for the moment. But as the adrenaline ebbed, a new dread settled in my gut with sickening certainty. If that thing was here, then where was Ella? The cabin's musty air clung to my lungs like grave soil as I fought to steady my ragged breathing. Outside, the creature's frantic scratching at the door filled the inky blackness, a relentless rhythm of unnatural hunger and fury. My mind spun, trying to reconcile the horrors I'd witnessed with any sane frame of reality. Fumbling in the dark, my hands ghosted over rough-hewn walls, seeking any source of light. My fingers found an old kerosene lantern, and after a few shaky attempts, a soft glow flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's musty confines. Dust and cobwebs adorned every surface, thickly layered through what seemed like years of neglect. But as my eyes adjusted, signs of more recent habitation began to emerge from the gloom. The remains of a meager fire smoldered in the hearth, and on a rough wooden table, a half-eaten meal lay congealing on a tin plate. Unease prickled along my spine. Who had been here, and where were they now? But the growls and thuds from the door left little room for such thoughts. I needed a weapon, and fast. My gaze landed on a rifle mounted above the fireplace, a relic from a bygone era of frontier life. I lunged for it, my hand shaking as I checked the chamber. Miraculously, it was loaded. Clutching the gun like a talisman, I crept to the window, peering through the grime-encrusted glass into the night beyond. The creature was still there, a misshapen silhouette pacing in the crawling darkness, waiting for me. I steadied the rifle against my shoulder, sighting down the barrel with a sense of grim purpose. This ended now. Breath held, finger tense on the trigger. I squeezed. The shot shattered the night. The rifle kicked, slamming into my shoulder. Through the window, I saw the creature jerk and stumble, an unholy shriek piercing the air. But it didn't fall. Hands slick with sweat, I fired again. The second shot cracked out on the heels of the first. This time, the creature crumpled, its agonized wails fading to wet, rasping gurgles. In the ringing silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Each thud was a mocking reminder of my own terrified mortality. Slowly, carefully, I stepped outside, the rifle trained unwaveringly on the twitching mass of shadows. As I drew closer, the lantern's glow fell across the creature's twisted form, and my stomach lurched. It was a grotesquerie of sinew and bone, a nightmarish patchwork that seemed to defy anatomy. Limbs bent at impossible angles, skin stretched taut over jutting protrusion. But most unsettling were its eyes, milky and dead. Yet somehow still full of malevolent hunger. I prodded it with the rifle's barrel, ready to unleash another round into its skull if needed. But it lay still, the forest's oppressive silence reclaimed the night. Ella. The thought hit me like a physical blow, spurring me back into motion. She was still out there somewhere alone, in these cursed woods with God knows what other horrors. I called out into the darkness, my voice sounding thin and small against the looming trees. But only the echo of my own desperation came back to me. Slowly and methodically, I began to search the area around the cabin, dread a leaden weight in my gut. The seconds ticked by each one, an eternity of gnawing fear. Then I saw her. She was crumpled at the base of a large oak, so still and pale that for a heart-stopping moment I feared the worst. But as I drew closer, I saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest, and relief crashed over me in a dizzying wave. Her clothes were torn and muddied, her skin mottled with bruises and cuts. But she was alive. Gently I gathered her in my arms, her head lolling limply against my chest. I carried her back to the cabin, laying her gently on the musty cot. In the lantern's flickering glow, I cleaned and dressed her wounds as best I could, all the while murmuring reassurances. I wasn't sure I believed. Through the long dark hours of the night I kept watch, the rifle never leaving my hands. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of night-woken creatures sent fresh jolts of terror through my exhausted body, but nothing else came. As the flushed, watery light of dawn began to seep through the trees, Ella stirred, her eyes fluttering open in confused panic. I tried to calm her, but the words felt hollow even to me. What comfort could I offer in the face of such unmitigated horror? Together, huddled in that lonely bastion against the dark, we waited for rescue. I returned to a world that made sense, where monsters were confined to the realm of nightmares and campfire tales. And even as the sun rose, burning away the night's terrors, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The forest had shown its true face, and it was one of primordial hunger and unrelenting nightmare. And I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it wasn't over. There would be more disappearances, more broken bodies, more nights of terror in the Harcourt Forest pitiless depths, because that is the true nature of evil. It is never satisfied. And in the shadows of those ancient trees, it had found the perfect hunting ground. Chapter 4. The journey back to civilization was a blur of pain and exhaustion, each step an agony of battered muscles and shredded nerves. Ella drifted in and out of consciousness, her mumbled words a fragmented litany of the horrors she had endured. I could only hold her close, offering what meager comfort my presence could provide. When we finally stumbled into the base camp, it was to a flurry of activity and shocked faces. Medics swarmed around us, their barked questions and probing hands a surreal counterpoint to the nightmare we'd just escaped. I could only watch numbly as they loaded Ella into a waiting ambulance, her pale face vanishing behind closing doors. A part of me longed to go with her, to cling to the one other person who understood the full extent of the horrors we'd faced. But duty held me back, the weight of the unsaid lying heavy on my tongue. The next few hours passed in a haze of debriefings and disbelief. I recounted the events over and over, each telling etching the memories more indelibly into my psyche. The skepticism on the faces of my superiors was palpable. Their doubtful looks were a clear indication of their struggle to reconcile the visceral terror of what happened with the mundane confines of their orderly world. A search team was dispatched to the coordinate. I provided an obligatory nod to procedure, but I could see it in their eyes. They were expecting to find nothing more than the fevered imaginings of a traumatized mind, and a part of me prayed that would be the case. Hours later, I sat bleary-eyed in the cheerless fluorescence of an interview room, nursing a cold cup of station coffee. I had been grilled, probed, and all but cross-examined about every detail of the ordeal. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the hollow ticking of the wall clock. Then the door slammed open. The lead investigator strode in, his face an ashen mask. In clipped tones, he informed me that they had found Lucas' body, or rather, what remained of it. At a few feet away, the twisted carcass of a creature that defied all natural law. The next pieces were relayed like fragments of a fever dream. Ella's stuttered recollection was a chilling echo of my own. The determination that the Harcourt forest was to be closed indefinitely within its bounds, now a forbidden zone of unspoken horrors, and through it, all the unshakable certainty in the eyes of those around me. The look one gives when peering into the abyss and seeing it peer back. In the days that followed, I drifted through a surreal landscape of half-lived moments and restless dreams. The media descended, as they always do when tragedy strikes. But even their most probing questions shied away from the full truth. There was an unspoken agreement that some horrors are best left in the shadows. I watched from afar as the official narrative took shape.
A tragic case of animal attack. A cautionary tale for the naive and unprepared.
The creature's existence was carefully omitted, explained away as the ravings of traumatized minds. And perhaps that was for the best. After all, who would believe such a tale? I scarcely believed it myself, and I had stared into the abyss of its milky, soulless eyes. Ella recovered at least in body. The hospital released her after a week. Her physical wounds were well on their way to healing, but the scars on her psyche, like mine, would linger long after the stitches were removed and the bruises faded. We spoke little in those early days, each grappling with the enormity of what we had endured in our own way. What words could encompass the sheer mind-bending horror of it all? How could we begin to process the fact that the solid, rational world we'd always known had been irrevocably shattered, revealing the squirming primordial chaos that lurked beneath? But gradually, tentatively, we began to piece together the fragments of our fractured reality. In hushed conversations over cooling cups of coffee, we pored over every excruciating detail of that fateful night, as if by repeating it, we could somehow rob it of its power. We combed through old records, folkloristic accounts, anything that might shed light on the monstrosity that had stalked those shadowed woods, and as we did, a stunning picture began to emerge. Whispers of disappearances stretching back decades, always in the same corner of the forest. Of tales passed down through generations of the local tribes, speaking of the hunger that lurked in the darkness, and the malevolent force that could twist flesh and warp bone. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This abomination had been preying on the unwary for longer than we could comprehend. And at the forest's closure, its hunting ground had been ripped away. The thought lodged in my gut like a ball of ice. If the creature's territory was no longer accessible, where would it turn to say its unnatural hunger? The image of it stalking new grounds, creeping ever closer to the unsuspecting bustle of civilization, filled me with a dread colder than any I had known in those nightmarish woods. I brought my fears to the authorities, pleading for action and warning, but I was met with polite dismissal, the patronizing assurances one gives to a frightened child, insisting on the monster under the bed. They had their narrative, and no amount of ravings from a broken man would sway them from it. And so I was left with a choice. To retreat into the comforting delusion of normalcy, lock away the horrors I'd seen, and try to forge a life in the lingering shadow of my fractured psyche, or to stand against the encroaching darkness, take up the mantle of guardian against the nightmare made flesh. In the end, it was no choice at all. I could no more turn my back on the truth than I could will my shattered leg to mend. And so, with grim resolve, I set myself to the task of hunting the hunter. I pored over maps, charting out the likely paths of the creature's migration. I delved into obscure tomes of folklore and demonology, arming myself with the terrifying wisdom of those who had faced such horrors before. And all the while, the weight of my self-appointed duty hung heavy on my shoulders, a burden I could share with no one except Ella. In her I found an unexpected ally, a kindred spirit forged in the crucible of shared trauma. Together we formed a strange partnership, a bond tempered by the fires of hell itself. By day, we maintained the facade of normalcy, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly like a half-remembered dream. But by night we hunted. We tracked the creature's movements, always one step behind, always fighting the sickening dread that we would be too late. More innocent blood would water the earth before we could intervene. It was a lonely, maddening existence, a purgatory of relentless vigilance and gnawing guilt. But it was the only path forward, the only way to find some shred of meaning from the jaws of impossible horror. And so we soldier on, Ella and I, lone guardians against the nightmare that stalks beyond the fringes of the world we once knew. Our days are haunted by the knowledge of the squirming chaos that lurks beneath the thin veneer of reality, our nights by the bone-deep certainty that our hunt is far from over, because in the end there can be no true escape from the abyss. Once it has fixed its gaze upon you, marked you as one of its own, it will never let you go. All you can do is stare back unflinching and pray that your will is strong enough to withstand the weight of its terrible regard. Such is the fate of those who have met the gaze of the hardcore horror, and God help any who cross its path unawares. The road stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the heart of a landscape that seemed increasingly alien with each passing mile. Beside me, Ella sat silently, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The months had worn on her, etching new lines of worry into her once youthful face, but beneath the weariness, a grim determination burned, a steely resolve that mirrored my own. We'd been on the creature's trail for weeks now, following a meandering path of half-whispered rumors and chilling coincidences. It had led us here, to this desolate stretch of highway bracketed by thick, brooding forest. As the miles ticked by, the sense of unease that had been growing in my gut reached a fever pitch. There was something in the air, a heaviness that went beyond the mere humidity of the summer evening. It was the same feeling I had experienced in those fateful woods, the suffocating scent of an ancient, malevolent presence. Ella felt it too. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the map spread across her lap. We exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the shared dread that coiled between us. As the sun began its slow descent into a blood-red horizon, we plowed into a small, nondescript town, the kind that dotted the landscape like forgotten islands in a sea of encroaching wilderness. It was the last outpost of civilization before the vast expanse of the forest proper, and the air of desolation that hung over its empty streets sent a chill down my spine. We found lodging in a decrepit motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where shadows seem to hold secrets best left unspoken. As we settled into the musty confines of our room, the weight of our purpose seemed to press down upon us with renewed urgency. We spent the evening poring over our notes, cross-referencing the scant clues we had gathered with the more esoteric sources I had managed to procure. It was a maddening puzzle, a twisted skein of folklore and fragmented accounts that hinted at a truth too terrible to contemplate. But as the night wore on, a pattern began to emerge. Whispers of an ancient site deep within the forest, a place steeped in dark legend and shunned by the local tribes. They spoke of it as a thin place, where the veil between worlds wore thin and the unnatural held sway. It was there we realized with sinking certainty that the creature would be drawn like a moth to an infernal flame. It would seek out the emanations of its own aberrant nature. We set out at first light, the morning mist still clinging to the trees like a shroud. The forest seemed to swallow us whole, the dense canopy blotting out the sun and casting everything in a gloomy half-light. With each step, the sense of oppressive dread grew, a physical weight that seemed to press against the lungs and slowed the beating of the heart. It was the same feeling I had experienced in the Harcourt forest, the suffocating sense of encroaching malevolence. As we pressed deeper into the woods, following a faint, half-forgotten trail, the signs of the creature's passage became more frequent. Shattered branches, claw marks gouged into the bark of ancient trees, and the occasional splash of ichor set the stomach roiling with its alien hue. And then we found it, a clearing, perfectly circular, as if scoured clean by some unnatural force. In the center, stone monolith rose from the earth, its surface carved with glyphs that seemed to writhe and twist in the corner of the eye. The air here was thick, cloying, laden with a scent that was at once familiar and utterly alien. The stench of the grave, of ancient crypts and moldering tombs, mingled with something else, something that set the primal hindbrain screaming in atavistic terror. And there it crouched at the base of the monolith, the creature. It was bigger than I remembered, its form swollen with some unnatural vitality, its milky eyes fixed upon us as we broke the tree line, and in their depths I saw a hunger that went beyond the mere need for frets. It was the hunger of the void, the insatiable longing of the abyss that gaped at the heart of all things. In that moment I understood with terrifying clarity the true nature of the horror we faced. It was not merely some aberrant beast, some freak of nature gone wrong. It was a manifestation of the unnameable, the crawling chaos that lurked beyond the fragile veil of sanity. Beside me, Ella raised her rifle, its barrel trained unwaveringly on the creature's misshapen skull. But even as her finger tightened on the trigger, I knew with sinking certainty that it would not be enough. This was not a battle that could be won with mere steel and gunpowder. It was a war waged on the borderlands of nightmare, where the very laws of reality broke down, and yet we had no choice. To turn back now, and to leave this abomination unchallenged, would be to condemn countless innocents to a fate worse than death. And so, with a wordless cry of defiance, we charged. What followed was a blur of blood and madness, a frenzied whirlwind of tooth and claw and eldritch horror. We fought with the desperate strength of those who know they are already lost, pouring every ounce of our will into the struggle, and somehow and possibly we prevailed. As the creature fell, its form dissolving into a noxious ether, I felt a surge of something akin to triumph. That it was short-lived, tempered by the knowledge of the cost at which it had come. For in that clearing, bathed in the sickly glow of the monolith, I saw the truth of our fate. We had started into the abyss, and in doing so, we had become a part of it. The taint of the unnameable clung to us now, an invisible mark that would never wash clean. We stumbled from those haunted woods, battered and broken, but alive. And yet, even as we emerged into the light of a world that seemed suddenly flimsy and false, I knew that our true struggle had only just begun. For we were the Watchers, now the guardians of a secret too terrible to be spoken. We had gazed upon the face of the crawling chaos, and in doing so, we had taken on a burden that could never be laid down. Our hunt was over, but our vigil had just begun. For as long as we drew breath, we would stand against the encroaching darkness, the lone bastions of sanity in a world gone mad. Such is the price of knowledge, the burden of those who have seen beyond the veil, and though the weight of it may crush the spirit and wither the soul, we will bear it unto the very gates of oblivion. For in the end there is no other choice. We are the Watchers now, and the night is long. The thing about working in Glacier National Park is you get used to feeling small, not just because of the mountains. Although, let me tell you, the peaks here are like gods looming over mortal men. It's a deeper smallness, the kind that settles in your bones when you're immersed in the vast wilderness day after day. Out here, nature has a way of reminding you of your place in the grand scheme of things. I've been a ranger in Glacier for 8 years now, and I've seen my share of strange and unsettling things, more than I bargained for when I first signed up. If I'm being honest, but nothing, not one single incident in all my time here could have prepared me for the events that unfolded in the summer of 2011. My name is Dale Renwick, and I'm not your stereotypical outdoorsman. Oh, I love the woods. Well enough, but I didn't grow up with a cabin in my backyard or spend my summers paddling canoes. No, I was raised in the flatlands of Nebraska, where the only trees were those sparse windbreaks the farmers planted between fields. I didn't lay eyes on a genuine mountain until I was 22 years old. But it was something about Glacier, something that sunk its claws into me the first time I visited and never let go. After college, I volunteered for a conservation project in the park, and from there, well, it was all downhill or uphill, depending on your perspective. Fast forward 8 years, and here I am, the go-to guy when hikers wander off trail, the one they call to wrangle ornery bears or escort overzealous tourists away from the cliffs. The morning this all started, I wasn't dealing with anything so routine. I was jolted awake by an early call about a family that had failed to return from what should have been a simple overnight trek near Two Medicine Lake. Mom, Dad, a teenage daughter, and a boy of about 8, the kind of nuclear family you see on park brochures. They had set off on one of our most gentle trails, nothing steep or technical about it. When families like that go missing 9 times out of 10, they sauntered in a few hours late, a little pink from sunburn, a little sheepish about losing the trail. But this time felt different from the moment I answered the phone. There was an unease coiling in my gut as I jotted down the details, and that unease only grew as I packed my gear and set off toward the trailhead. The first real red flag came when I spoke to their guide, a seasoned veteran of the park named Bert Hines. Bert had been leading hikes and glacier treks for decades, and I'd never known him to be easily rattled. But his voice over the radio that morning had a tremor to it I'd never heard before. Dale, he said, his words clipped and terse. This family did something odd, split up on the trail, which I never advise. Wife and daughter stuck to the path, but something spooked them badly. I asked them to find the dad and boy, but when I circled back, the women were gone, vanished. I frowned, feeling uneasy, prickles crawling up my spine. People don't just vanish in Glacier country. Not like that. Oh, we've had our share of folks getting lost, but the whole family, with Bert's eyes on them, it didn't sit right. The protocol was protocol, and missing hikers meant it was time to mobilize search and rescue. I radioed back to confirm I was on my way and finished throwing my pack together. Flashlight flares, first aid kit, the usual accoutrements of a backcountry search. It was still early morning when I arrived at the trailhead, the sun just starting to burn off the mist that clung to the pines. Bert was already there, along with another ranger I only vaguely recognized. They both looked ashen in the pale light, strained in a way I'd never seen before on the faces of my fellow rangers. Harp was rambling as I approached, going on about strange tracks that he couldn't quite identify. That alone was enough to give me pause. Bert's skill at tracking was near legendary in the park. If he couldn't identify a print, couldn't even hazard a guess, then we were in uncharted waters. We split up to cover more ground. Bert and the other ranger took the western trails while I struck out toward the lake. The first hour of the search yielded nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual sounds of wilderness going about its business. But the further I trekked into the trees, the more oppressive the silence became. Not the peaceful quiet that sometimes falls in the woods, but a smothering, absolute absence of noise. Even the wind seemed to still in the branches overhead. I was well trained in wilderness survival, knew how to keep a level head in challenging situations, but I couldn't shake the growing certainty that I was not alone in those trees. The back of my neck prickled with a distinct sensation of being watched. Usually that feeling means you've intruded on a bear's territory or wandered too close to a cougar's hunting grounds. But this felt different, wholly unfamiliar, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I was just about to turn back to Radio Bert and regroup when I noticed something on the trail ahead of me. I moved closer, squinting in the dappled light. It was a footprint, but not one that belonged to any creature I recognized. It was too large for a wolf, too elongated and narrow for a bear. If I had to put a name to it, I'd say it looked almost human, but stretched and distorted, with claw marks gouging deep into the earth at its toes. The print was strange enough on its own, but what truly unnerved me was the lack of any other sign around it. Just the one track with no indication of what direction the creature had come from or gone. No broken branches, no disturbances in the undergrowth. Like the thing had materialized from thin air, left its mark, and vanished again. I swallowed hard against the sudden dryness in my throat and raised my radio to my lips, intending to call it in. But only static crackled on the other end, the signal choked off by the dense trees. With a muttered curse, I clipped the useless device back to my belt. It looked like I was on my own, at least for the moment. Fighting back a growing sense of dread, I began to follow the track, scanning the forest floor for any further sign. The punt appeared only intermittently, separated by stretches of pristine ground, as though the creature took unnaturally large strides or perhaps flew between landings. Every instinct I had, every bit of wilderness training told me to turn back, to not pursue this thing alone. But the knowledge of the missing family spurred me forward. If there was even a chance they were still alive, I had to try. As I moved deeper into the trees, the silence grew heavier, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. The quality of the light began to change, the golden morning rays filtering down through the leaves, taking on a sickly greenish cast. The air felt different, too thick and cloying in my lungs, carrying an unfamiliar stench that I could only describe as rotten vegetation mixed with something sharper and more metallic. Just when I was beginning to think I'd lost the trail entirely, I spotted something ahead. A flash of color in the endless brown and green. I quickened my pace, hope kindling in my chest at the thought that it might be a piece of clothing from one of the missing hikers. But as I drew closer, the object resolved into something that made my step falter and my blood run cold. It was skin, human skin hanging in tatters from a low-hanging branch. I've seen a lot in my years as a ranger. Nature can be brutal, and I've come across my share of unfortunate souls who met a cruel end in the wilderness. But this was something else entirely. The skin hanging before me was unmistakably human, but it was removed with a precision that seemed almost surgical. No ragged tears, no sign of animal mauling, just a neat, clean strip of flesh swaying in the breeze. I fought down the urge to gag the taste of bile rising in the back of my throat. With a shaking hand, I pulled out my flashlight and shone the beam up into the branches, dreading what else I might find. And sure enough, caught in the glare of the light, was what remained of a man's torso. The skin peeled away to expose glistening muscle in the stark white of bone. There wasn't enough left for a definitive identification, but deep in my gut I knew it was the missing father. No other hikers had been reported in this area, and the wounds, if you could call them that, seemed far too fresh for this to be some unrelated casualty. I fumbled for my radio again, desperate to raise Bert to call in reinforcements, but the static remained impenetrable. Of course, I thought bitterly the one time I desperately need the damn thing to work. I was on my own, that much was clear. And whatever had done this, whatever was stalking these woods, it wasn't like anything I'd encountered before. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to retreat, to get back to civilization and regroup. But the thought of the rest of that family out there possibly suffering the same fate as the man in the tree propelled me onward. As I pressed deeper into the forest, I found more grim markers of the creature's passage. Here a severed arm, a hand curled into a rictus of agony. There, a single leg, the flesh razored away with that same eerie precision, and everywhere that same oppressive silence, as though even the birds and insects dared not draw the attention of the thing that haunted these woods. What struck me most, even more than the gruesome nature of the remains, was the lack of blood. With wands like these, the forest floor should have been slick with it. The coppery scent hung heavy in the air, but there was nothing, just the eerie slivers of flesh suspended from the trees like macabre ornaments. I felt my own heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in tight, controlled bursts. I was no longer just searching for survivors. I was hunting, tracking a predator unlike any I'd ever known. Or a chilly voice whispered in the back of my mind. Perhaps it was hunting me. I was just beginning to consider the merits of that dark thought when a sound shattered the silence around me. It was a scream, high and sharp with terror, and it was too close for comfort, but also too close to ignore. I bolted toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or caution. If one of the missing family members was still alive, if there was even a chance I could reach them in time, I had to try. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging trails in their wake. But I hardly noticed. All my focus was bent on that scream, on the desperate hope that I wouldn't be too late. I burst into a small clearing and stumbled to a halt, my breath seizing in my chest as I took in the sight before me. There, propped against the broad trunk of an ancient fir, was the missing boy. He was alive, if you could call the state he was in living. He slumped over, facing away from me, but even from a distance I could tell something was horribly wrong. The boy's skin had a stretched, waxy appearance as though it had been pulled too tight over the fragile bones beneath. As I watched, frozen in a moment of pure visceral horror, he twitched and spasmed, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. And then, with a movement that was far too fluid, far too boneless, he began to turn toward me. I think I screamed then, or maybe I just opened my mouth in a silent cry of revulsion. Because, as the boy's face came into view, I saw that it was no longer a face at all. It was a ruin of raw flesh and exposed bone. The skin had been stripped away as neatly as it had been from the corpses I'd found. But this was no corpse. The boy was moving, twitching his lipless mouth, gaping in a silent moan. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to process the impossible sight before me.
This couldn't be happening.
It had to be a nightmare, some fevered hallucination born of stress and exhaustion. But the boy kept coming, dragging himself toward me with a determined, almost mechanical persistence. I knew I should do something, try to help him or at least end his suffering, but my body seemed locked in place. My limbs turned to stone by the sheer wrongness of what I was witnessing. It wasn't until the boy let out another moan, this one thick and wet and utterly inhuman, that I was jolted from my paralysis. I turned to run, but I had barely taken a step when a sound from behind me froze the blood in my veins. It was a growl, low and guttural, filled with a malevolence that seemed to resonate in my very bones. I rolled around, my hands scrabbling for the bear spray on my belt. Though what good it would do against a creature that could inflict such horrors, I couldn't say. The thing that emerged from the trees was unlike anything I had ever seen in nature or in my darkest imaginings. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a gaunt, elongated body that seemed to unfold itself from the shadows. Its skin was mottled gray, slick and shiny like an amphibian's, but stretched tight over a frame that was hideously, impossibly thin. But it was the creature's face that truly froze me in my tracks, or rather its lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin broken only by a wide, gaping maw filled with rows of needle-like teeth. As I stared, transfixed by the sheer alien nature of the thing, It swung its head towards me, and I swear I felt the weight of its eyeless gaze boring into my soul. In that moment, I knew with a terrible certainty that I was going to die in those woods. This creature, this thing that defied all natural law, would peel the skin from my bones, just as it had done to the unfortunate souls before me. And in some dark, primal corner of my mind, I almost welcomed it, if only as an end to the incomprehensible terror that gripped me. But some stubborn spark of survival instinct refused to be snuffed out. As the creature took a lumbering step toward me, its talons gouging deep furrows in the earth, I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned and ran, crashing blindly through the underbrush in a frantic bid to escape the nightmare snapping at my heels. I ran like I'd never run before, with the primal, mindless desperation of a creature pursued by death itself. The forest blurred around me, a smear of greens and browns, the trunks of ancient trees flashing by in a dizzying rush. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging welts in their wake, but I hardly felt them. All sensation had narrowed to the burn of my lungs, the pounding of my heart, and the dreadful certainty of the thing behind me. I could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, its long limbs snapping saplings like twigs, its bulk shaking the very earth with each thunderous step. It was gaining on me. I knew it as surely as I'd ever known anything. My penny human speed was nothing compared to the tireless lope of that abomination. And then, just when I thought my straining lungs would burst, when the metallic tang of exhaustion became an almost welcome promise of oblivion, the creature's pursuit suddenly ceased. The crashing faded, the forest settling into an eerie stillness, broken only by my ragged gasps. I stumbled to a halt, bracing my hands on my knees as I fought to suck air into my burning lungs. I thought I should keep moving, put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. But some morbid curiosity, a suicidal need to understand the horrific events unfolding around me, compelled me to look back. The creature was standing at the edge of a small ravine. I must have leaped in my blind flight. It was swaying slightly, its elongated head tilting in a disturbingly bird-like fashion. As I watched, hardly daring to breathe, it seemed to scent the air, that fang-filled maw gaping wide. For a moment, I was certain it would bound across the ravine and resume its implacable pursuit. But to my endless shock, after a long, tense moment, the fan turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees. Just like that, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature was gone. I stood there trembling with mingled exhaustion and adrenaline, trying to wrap my mind around what I had just experienced. A part of me, the rational part that had served me well in my years as a ranger, insisted that this had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of the mind stressed beyond endurance. People didn't just lose their faces, and creatures like the one that had pursued me didn't exist outside of horror movies and fevered nightmares. But another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, knew with dreadful certainty that what I had seen was real. The pain of the scratches on my arms, the burn in my lungs, the sweat cooling on my brow. These were not the sensations of a dream, and the skin, the awful empty face of that boy. No, my subconscious wasn't twisted enough to conjure something like that. As my heartbeat gradually slowed and my breathing evened out, I forced myself to confront the reality of my situation. I was deep in the wilderness, miles from any kind of help, with a creature straight out of a nightmare stalking these woods. And God helped me. I was the only one who knew about it. I had to get back to the ranger station. I had to report what I'd seen. But even as the thought formed, I felt a sinking certainty that it would do no good. Who would believe me? Even I was having trouble accepting the evidence of my own senses. And what could we do? Even if they did take me seriously, this thing, whatever it was, seemed to obey no natural law. Bullets, bear spray, all our usual defenses seemed laughably inadequate against a being that could strip a man's flesh from his bones without spilling a drop of blood. But I had to try. For the sake of that family, for the sake of anyone else who might wander unknowingly into this creature's territory, I had to do something. With a groan, I pushed myself upright, every muscle screaming in protest. I took a moment to get my bearings. The eerie silence of the forest pressed in around me. I peered into the trees, half expecting to see that eyeless face peering back at me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the still, watchful presence of the ancient pine. I set off in what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead, my steps heavy with fatigue and dread. I tried to stay alert, listening for any indication that the creature had resumed its pursuit. But the only sound was my own labored breathing and the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I walked for what felt like hours, the sun crawling across the sky above the dense canopy. At times I wondered if I was walking in circles. The endless expanse of trees played tricks on my exhausted mind. But it forced myself to keep moving, clinging to the hope that each step brought me closer to safety. When I finally stumbled out onto the trail, the sight of that narrow, familiar path nearly brought me to my knees with relief. I staggered forward, my pace quickening as the trailhead came into view. Bert's truck was still parked where we'd left it, a sight so blessedly ordinary that I could have wept. But my relief was short-lived. As I drew closer, I saw Bert and the other ranger huddled together, their faces drawn and pale. They looked up as I approached, and the look in their eyes told me all I needed to know. "You saw it too," I said, my voice sounding alien to my own ears. "Didn't you?" Bert nodded slowly, his grizzled face seeming to have aged a decade in the space of a day. Not clearly," he said, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "But I felt it like a shadow in the corner of your eye, something that ain't meant to be seen by the likes of us." I sank down onto the bumper of the truck, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "Goodbye," I said. "Did you?" Bert shook his head. "No sign," he said. "No sign of any of them, just those tracks, those god-awful prints, like something from a fever dream." We sat in silence for a long moment, each of us struggling to come to terms with the impossible reality we found ourselves in. Finally, Bert spoke again. "What do we do, Dale?" he asked, and I was struck by how small, how lost he sounded. Bert, who had always been the steady one, the unflappable veteran of these woods. What in God's name do we do? I wished I had an answer. I wished with a sudden desperate ferocity that this was all a dream, that I would wake up safe in my bed with the sunlight streaming through the windows and the sounds of the park stirring to life outside. That this was no dream and no amount of wishing would make it so. We were standing on the edge of a nightmare, one that threatened to swallow us whole. And heaven help us, we had no choice but to face it head on. The following days passed in a blur of activity and dread. We called in reinforcements, of course, more rangers, search and rescue teams, even a few state troopers. But what could we tell them? The truth was too incredible, too horrifying to be believed. So we fell back on the old standbys. A rogue bear, perhaps, or a particularly vicious mountain lion, anything to rationalize the carnage we'd witnessed. And as we scoured the woods, even as we combed every inch of those forested slopes, I knew in my heart that we would find nothing. Whatever had taken that family, it was no creature of earthly origin. It moved in the shadows, in the spaces between one breath and the next. It was a thing of nightmare and shadow, and it would not be found unless it wished to be. And oh, how I feared that wish. Every moment I spent in those woods, every step I took along those winding trails, I could feel the weight of its presence. It was watching, always watching, with an eyeless, insatiable hunger that chilled me to the marrow of my bones. That night, when exhaustion finally drove me to my tent in the fitful embrace of sleep, I was haunted by visions of that awful empty face. I would jerk awake, my heart pounding, certain that I had felt the brush of those talons against my skin, the hot, fetid breath of that maw against my cheek. But there was never anything there. Just the still, suffocating darkness of the night pressing in around me. As the day stretched into a week with no sign of the family or the creature that had taken them, a grim realization began to settle over the search party. We were chasing a ghost, a phantom that had vanished as suddenly and completely as mist beneath the morning sun. The official word came down from on high. This search was to be called off, the family presumed dead by misadventure. Case closed, the record sealed for the sake of the public's peace of mind. But for those of us who had seen the truth, who had felt the icy touch of that nameless horror, there would be no peace. We were changed, marked by an encounter with something that defied all rational understanding. We went back to our lives, back to the mundane routine of ranger work, but a part of us was forever trapped in that grim, haunted wood. I tried to move on, tried to lose myself in the day-to-day tasks of maintaining the park, but every shadow held a menace now. Every rustling branch was a whisper of unnatural hunger. I would find myself staring into the tree line, my heart in my throat, certain that I had caught a glimpse of that gaunt, elongated form lurking just beyond the reach of the light. My fellow rangers, those who had shared in the horror of that experience, fared little better. Gert retired not long after, his eyes haunted and his hands never quite steady. Others simply vanished, walking off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Whether they met a fate similar to that unfortunate family or simply could not bear the weight of what they had seen, I cannot say. As for me, I clung to my duty like a drowning man to a life raft. The work had been my life, my calling, and I could not imagine abandoning it, even in the face of such unimaginable horror. That I was a changed man, walking through my days with a grim, wary cast in my eyes, forever glancing over my shoulder for a glimpse of that which should not be. It was on one such day, a crisp and clear morning in late autumn, that I found myself once again walking the trails near to Medicine Lake. The leaves had long since turned, painting the forest in a riot of reds and golds, and the air was sharp with the promise of coming snow. It was a beautiful day, the kind that would have once filled my heart with peace and contentment. But as I walked, I could feel that old familiar dread creeping up my spine. The forest was too still, too silent, just like it had been on that awful day all those years ago. I found myself straining to hear the slightest sound, the crunch of a leaf or the snap of a twig, anything to break that oppressive silence. And then in the distance I heard it, a scream, high and thin and full of terror. It was the sound of my nightmares, the sound that had haunted my dreams for years uncounted. I froze, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a moment I was torn by indecision, my mind racing with the memory of that twisted, lurching form crashing through the underbrush. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But another part of me, forged in the crucible of that horrific encounter, knew that I could not turn away. If there was even a chance that someone was in danger, that the creature had returned to stalk new prey, I had to act. I had followed that family all those years ago, failed to save them from an unimaginable fate. I could not fail again. With a deep breath, I turned in the direction of the scream and began to run. I crashed through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The scream had faded, but I could still hear it echoing in my mind, a desperate, pleading wail that seemed to pierce the very fabric of my soul. As I ran, I realized with a sinking certainty that I was retracing my steps, following the same path I had taken all those years ago. The trees, the contours of the land, even the quality of the light filtering through the leaves, it was all hauntingly, dreadfully familiar. And then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I had imagined the scream, if this was all some cruel trick of my haunted mind, I saw it. A flash of color in the trees ahead, a stark tark to the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. I stumbled to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. There, just visible, in a shaft of sunlight that had broken through the canopy, was a scrap of fabric. It was bright red, the color of fresh blood against the faded leaves. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The memories came flooding back, a tide of horror and helplessness that threatened to drown me where I stood. The faceless boy, the gaping maw of the creature, the awful empty silence of the forest. It was all there, as vivid and terrible as the day it happened, but I forced myself to take a step forward and then another. I had to know. I had to see if my worst fears had been realized. With trembling hands, I reached out and grasped the fabric, lifting it gently from the branch where it had snagged. It was a jacket, a child's jacket, the kind you might see on any playground or schoolyard. But as I held it up to the light, I felt my blood run cold. There, on the back, was a name stitched in cheerful, colorful letters, Timmy. The world seemed to tilt around me, my vision swimming with sudden horrified understanding. This was no random scrap of cloth, no accidental remnant of some hiker's passing. This was a message, a cruel, taunting reminder of my failure all those years ago. I spun around in circles, pounding my eyes frantically, scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. But there was nothing, just the same oppressive silence that had haunted me for so long. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard it. A laugh low and guttural and filled with a malevolence that seemed to shake the very earth beneath my feet. It was a sound I had heard before in the darkest corners of my nightmares. The sound of the creature that had taken that family, that had shattered my world and left me a haunted, broken man. I ran with a desperation born of pure primal terror. I ran as I had never run before, crashing through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches that tore at my skin and clothes. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until the laughter faded into the distance and the forest seemed to swallow me whole. I don't know how long I ran or how far. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green-shaded world, the minutes and hours blurring together in a haze of exhaustion and dread. But eventually I found myself stumbling out onto a familiar trail, the same one I had walked so many times before. I staggered to a halt, my chest heaving, my vision blurred with sweat and tears. And there, just ahead of me, I saw a figure emerge from the trees. For a moment, my heart seized with terror, certain that it was the creature that had finally come to claim me as it had claimed so many others. But as the figure drew closer, I realized with a shock that it was human. A man, tall and lean, with a shock of graying hair and a face lined with the weight of years and sorrows. "Dale," he said softly with understanding. "It's me, Bert." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process this sudden intrusion of normalcy into my nightmare world. "Bert," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What? What are you doing here?" He smiled, a sad, weary smile that seemed to hold the weight of all the years between us. "I had a feeling," he said simply, "a feeling that you might need a friend." I felt something break inside me then, a dam of pent-up emotion and trauma that had been building for longer than I cared to remember. I stumbled forward, my legs giving way, and Bert caught me, his arms strong and steady around my shoulders. We stood there for a long time, two old friends, united by a shared horror, a shared understanding of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. And in that moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Not hope that the creature was gone or that the nightmares would ever truly fade, but hope that I wasn't alone, that there were others who understood, who had seen the face of true horror and lived to tell the tale. As Bert helped me back to the ranger station, my steps slow and faltering, I knew that my life would never be the same. I was a marked man, forever changed by my brush with the unspeakable, but I also knew that I had a duty, a responsibility to those who walked these trails, unaware of the horrors that lurked in the shadow. I would be their watchman, their guardian against the darkness. And though I knew I could never truly defeat the creature that haunted these woods, I could at least ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate as that unfortunate family. It was a heavy burden, a lonely vigil, but it was one I would bear gladly for the sake of all those who sought solace and beauty in the wild places of the world. And perhaps in some small way it would bring a measure of peace to the restless ghosts that haunted my dreams and to the faceless boy who had never had the chance to grow up. I was standing in the middle of a dense, overgrown forest in western Oregon, trying to figure out how I ended up here. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time in places like this, trekking through the wilderness with my uncle who used to work as a forest ranger. He taught me to appreciate the quiet danger of the wild, the way it could be both breathtakingly beautiful and deadly at the same time. Those early lessons served me well over the years. I guess you could say they're what made me so good at my job now. Hunting things that most people never even realized existed outside of campfire stories and dark legends. My name is Travis Fenwick, and I'm part of a specialized unit that operates under the radar, far from the eyes of the public or any official oversight. You won't find records of us in any government database. We're the sort of ghosts that only exist in whispers passed between those who've seen what really hides in the shadows of the fringes of the map. What we deal with are cryptids, creatures of myth and folklore that aren't supposed to be real but are, and they're dangerous. I've been called in to investigate a series of strange disappearances and animal mutilations in the Tillamook State Forest. Local authorities were stumped. It was a vast, remote wilderness known for its misty beauty, but also steeped in dark history and unsettling tales passed down through generations. Workers told stories of a creature that lurked in the deep woods, something huge and feral that could rip a man limb from limb. Old-timers spoke of settlers and native tribes that went missing without a trace. At first glance, the handful of unexplained incidents in the area seemed like tragic but unremarkable accidents. People get lost in the woods sometimes. Hikers stumble into bear dens or off unmarked trails. It happened. But certain details stood out to me: the savagery of the wounds on the recovered bodies, the absence of tracks around the scenes, the way it seemed to strike with uncanny stealth, leaving no survivors or witnesses. I'd seen this before, or at least something like it. My instincts told me we weren't dealing with a normal predator, but something much older and smarter. And based on the lore I dug up, I had to hunch what it might be: the Keishi. The name surfaced in some of the earliest stories from the land's native people. Later accounts from fur trappers and frontiersmen described a massive wolf-like creature with eerie intelligence that could hunt unseen and vanish like mist. Unlike Sasquatch or other famed cryptids, this one didn't have a cute nickname. People spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all. There was something about how it killed, ritualistic, vindictive even. Now, it seemed to be back haunting the same primordial forest it always had. It wasn't the first time I tracked something out of a nightmare, but this felt different, like the forest itself carried a sense of malice. The reports I was reading painted a grim picture, not just a rogue beast on a killing spree, but something that knew how to hunt us, how to terrify us. I gathered my team and we headed in, just 4 of us, packing enough munitions and arcane warding spells to hopefully bag this thing. My buddy Hank, an ex-Marine built like a tank, would never admit it, but I knew even he was nervous. Sarah, our tracker, who could anticipate a tiger by its shadow, kept glancing over her shoulder at sounds only she could hear. Chris, the team's technical expert, had gone quieter than usual, double and triple checking his equipment. Not that I blamed any of them. We were about to wade into the briar patch to face an ancient apex predator that had stalked this land since before the first songs were sung to keep the dark at bay. And if half of what those faded first-hand accounts claimed was true, it had a taste for human fear. We all wore stoic faces, but I could feel the unease rippling beneath the surface. So there I stood at the shattered maw of one of the continent's most untamed forests, with only a few clawed bones and my team's skills and courage between us and something that wanted to pull our world back into fearful whispers around a flickering fire. Hank flashed me a tight grin. Sarah nodded like she was accepting an unspoken challenge. Then Chris, Or Chris just looked determined to be done with this so he could get back to his Wall Street numbers. I took a deep breath, the green cathedral hush of the forest heavy in my lungs, and motioned for them to move ahead of me. It was time to pit science against superstition and pray we weren't already too late. The quiet of the forest pressed in around us as we made our way deeper into the Tillamook. Following the overgrown remains of an old hunting trail, the air grew thick and soupy, each breath more labored than the last. Even the usual sounds of nature, bird songs and leaf rustle, were muted as if the residents of this emerald world knew better than to draw attention to themselves. It was a feeling I'd come to associate with the hunting grounds of monsters. Wood split into teams of 2 to cover more ground, with Hank and Sarah ranging ahead while Chris and I brought up the rear. The idea was to locate any fresh sign and regroup to strategize our approach. Simple enough in theory, but the knowing in my guts told me it wouldn't be that clean. The Kaishi had been doing this dance for centuries. It wouldn't be caught off guard by a 4-person band of high-tech monster chasers. Chris must have sensed my unease. He shot me a quizzical look as he adjusted the pack laden with his surveillance gear. "What's eating you, Trav?" We've dealt with some real cryptozoological nasties before. Chupacabras, bayugles, even that rogue skinwalker out in the painted desert. How's this different? I appreciated his attempt to cut through the tension, but it rang hollow in the gloom beneath those towering Douglas fir trees. Just a feeling. I sat scanning the green tangle for any flicker of movement. The lore on this one isn't like the others. More personal somehow. Like it's not just some unthinking beast. What you're saying is that it plots and strategizes. There was an uncertain half-laugh behind his words, a slim shield against the strangeness of it all. I didn't answer right away. Didn't know how to put into words the certainty that had been growing since I first opened this case file. Finally, I just shrugged. Maybe it's just really old and really angry. Either way, underestimating it would be a mistake. We lapsed back into silence, then picked our way over gnarled roots and rocky outcroppings. The old stories spun through my head as we walked, fragments and recurring themes stitching themselves together. A shape in the fog, eyes that shone with uncanny knowing. The wrenching loss that followed its appearances resonated through history like ripples from a stone cast into a still pool. And then shredding the heavy quiet like claws through flesh. A distant scream pierced the forest. Sarah's scream, Hank's wordless bellow, followed a beat later booming through the trees. Chris and I froze for the space of a shared heartbeat. The echoes of our teammates' distress were still ringing in our ears. I saw my own dawning horror mirrored on his face. "Hike. Sarah." I cowed my radio as we broke into a dead run, boots churning the loamy earth.
Report.
"What's your status?" The only answer was a static-filled silence that went on far too long. Finally broken by Hank's panting voice, audibly shaken even through the tinny speaker. It came out of nowhere, Trav. "Fast got Sarah. She's gone, man. It took her." A cold sinking dread knotted in my stomach. I'd seen what even young, inexperienced cryptids could do in close quarters. I didn't want to imagine what a primordial nightmare like the Kaishi could inflict. "Is it still there? Do you have eyes on it?" I demanded. Negative. It disappeared back into the brush like a damn ghost. "What the hell is this thing, Trav?" Hank's voice had taken on a hollowness I'd never heard from him before, and it chilled me more than the thought of what we were facing. If it could rattle Hank, the human equivalent of a battleship. I swallowed hard, exchanging a grim glance with Chris. "Stay where you are. We're coming to you. Keep watch and stay alert." I cut the connection and poured on more speed, leaping over fallen branches and ducking whip-like vines. As I ran, the old stories and reports snapped into focus, painting a clearer picture. The Kaishi didn't just kill, it stalked. It hunted. More than just a predator, it was something that lived for the chase, for the slow creeping terror of its prey. And now, as the forest blurred around me and my heart jackhammered in my ears, one appalling realization crystallized. The Kaishi wasn't just hunting us. It was herding us deeper into its domain, into the primeval heart of the forest, where its legend was born, where it was the unquestioned apex, the undisputed nightmare-made flesh, where no help could reach us and no light could banish its shadow. We'd walked willingly into the monster's lair, and like a Venus flytrap closing around a hapless insect, the forest seemed to swallow us, cutting off any path of retreat with suffocating malice. The hunt was on, and we were no longer the hunters, we were the hunted, and the odds of us all making it out alive had just narrowed to a hoarse, ragged whisper of a prayer. We found Hank half a click from the ambush site, his back to one of the massive ancient trees that formed a loose perimeter. Even with his camo patterns and shielding wardings, he stood out like a felled redwood amidst the clinging underbrush. His rifle was up, panning the green curtain, but I could see the minute tremors in his hands as we approached. Hank, I called out softly, pitching my voice just above the ambient forest noise. It's us. He didn't lower his weapon, not at first, but more than anything told me how badly the encounter had shaken him when he finally let the rifle drop. His withered face was ashen beneath the mask of sweat and grime that came from fucking nowhere. He bit out his voice like ground glass, snatched Sarah right out from under me, didn't even have time to get a shot off. I didn't need to ask him to clarify. There would have been signs of a struggle, but Hank wasn't splashed with gore, and the forest floor around the tree was pristine, just a scattering of leaves over dark, soft earth. Ikayoshi had taken Sarah as cleanly as a magician's trick, leaving no trace. What did it look like? I asked. Did you get a visual? Hank shook his head in a tight, jerky motion. Just a blur. It didn't move like a normal animal. I'd expect that much. Witness reports were all the same. A hulking shadow appeared and was gone between one blink and the next. Some who'd gotten a longer look described a creature that was wolf-like but stretched and distorted as if reflected in a cracked mirror. Either way, it was becoming clear we weren't equipped for this. Not by a long shot. So what now? Chris asked, his voice brittle with strain. We're down a team member, we've lost the initiative, and we're deep in this thing's turf. Please tell me there's a plan that doesn't involve us getting picked off one by one. I grimaced, feeling the weight of their eyes on me. They were looking to me for answers, direction, hope, and I was coming up short on all fronts. We stick together, I said finally. No more splitting up. We find a defensible spot and dig in until daybreak. Then you get out of here and call for reinforcements. It was a bitter pill to swallow the idea of retreat, leaving these woods without Sarah or the Kiyashi's pelt as a trophy. But I had to be realistic. We were a man down, our weapons seemed all but useless, and we were in completely over our heads. Every instinct I had honed over a decade of hunting horrors was screaming at me to get my team out while we still could. But even as I laid out the plan, I could feel the forest pressing in around us, a malevolent weight that seemed to pulse with a savage alien intelligence. The Kayashi was out there watching us, toying with us, and wasn't going to let us go that easily. It started as a whisper among the trees, a susurrus of rustling leaves that didn't match the still air. Then came the snapping of twigs, the crunch of pine needles beneath unseen feet, all around us, just at the edge of perception, but drawing closer with every passing second. We went back to back without a word, weapons up and trained on the encircling shadows. My heart was a jackhammer behind my ribs, my skin electric, with the certainty that we were no longer the apex predators here. We were mice caught in the cat's paw, permitted to scurry and squeak until the killing blow fell, then as if a switch had been flipped, the noises ceased. The forest went preternaturally still, not even a bird's wing fluttered to break the silence. For a long moment we held our collective breath, fingers white-knuckled on triggers. every sense straining for a hint of what was coming. The attack, when it came, was a blitzkrieg of tooth and claw from an impossible angle. It burst from the canopy above us, a hurtling mass of fur and fury that slammed into Hank with the force of a wrecking ball. He went down screaming, his rifle firing wildly as he grappled with a huffing, snarling bulk that seemed to dwarf his massive frame. Chris and I reacted on pure instinct, our weapons roaring in the close confines of our skirmish line. But even as bullets pinged off rock and tore through leaves, I knew it was hopeless. The thing was too fast, too cunning. Used Hank's body as a shield, dragging him into the underbrush even as he bucked and flailed. And then, in a shambling heartbeat, they were gone. Swallowed by the forest as completely as if the earth had opened up and devoured them. Only the echoes of Hank's choked pleas, abruptly silenced, marked their passage. Chris and I stood, our chests heaving, surrounded by smoking brass and a miasma of cordite. His eyes were wide and wild when they met mine, the unspoken question hanging between us. What now? I had no answers, no plan. All my experience, all my hard-won knowledge of how to hunt monsters seemed suddenly and utterly useless. We weren't just in over our heads. We were drowning in an abyssal darkness. We had no hope of navigating. The Kesahi had claimed 2 of us with barely a fight. It was playing a game older than human civilization, and we fumbling intruders had been arrogant enough to think we could best it. Now we were going to pay the price for that arrogance one by one until the forest ran red and the monster was sated. Unless I could turn the tables, use its own tactics against it, but that would mean descending into a savagery I'd long held at bay, embracing a darkness I'd spent my whole life running from. It would mean becoming a monster to fight a monster. I looked at Chris, at the naked fear and desperate hope in his eyes, and I knew I had no choice. For him, for Sarah and Hank, for all the lives the Kesahi had stolen over the centuries, I would do what needed to be done. I would walk into the abyss and pray I could find my way back out again. We need to move, I said, my voice low-ed with a finality that seemed to come from somewhere else. It's not done with us yet, but this time we're going to be the ones setting the ambush. We ran. What else could we do? The compass of my morality had been smashed. Its needles spinning uselessly as I led Chris ever deeper into the forest, into the very heart of darkness. I told myself it was tactical necessity that we needed to put as much distance between ourselves and the last attack site as possible. But even as those words formed in my mind, I could feel the exultation of the Kesahi as it ran alongside us on silent paws. It was herding us exactly where it wanted us to go. I know that now with a resigned dread that tasted like old ashes on my tongue. Every step was in lockstep with its design, every ragged breath of victory chorus in its ancient years. The thoughts settled in my guts like a ball of lead, cold and nauseating. We couldn't run forever. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed in protest as we crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at our faces and snagged at our clothes. Chris was flagging beside me. His breathing was a harsh hitching counterpoint to the drum of our footfalls. I risked a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the Kiashi stalking us in plain sight, savoring our futile flight. But there was only the forbidding wall of trees, their trunks blurring into a single impenetrable mass as the shadows lengthened. We couldn't keep this up. Sooner or later we would have to make a stand, even if every rational fiber of my being railed against the idea. The Kiashi had already proven itself the apex predator in this emerald hellscape. What chance did we have, armed only with our wits and a few scraps of metal and magic? But then, as we burst into a small clearing, a flicker of inspiration pierced the fog of exhaustion and dread. The clearing was a near-perfect circle, the ground carpeted with a dense layer of fallen leaves and twigs. At its center stood a towering fir, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. It was as if the forest had provided the stage for our final confrontation, and in that moment I knew what we had to do. Chris' I panted, skidding to a halt at the tree. "We need to get up it." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, but there was method to my madness. If we could gain the high ground, force the Kiyashi to come to us. I didn't wait for his agreement. I was already moving, scrabbling at the rough bark, using knots and low-hanging branches to haul myself up. After a moment's hesitation, I heard Chris follow, his breath rasping in his throat. We climbed like men possessed, fueled by fear and adrenaline, which lent strength to our trembling limbs. The fallow seemed to reach forever into the gathering dusk, its upper branches lost in a green haze. But finally, mercifully, we reached a sturdy perch, a natural platform formed by the intersection of three massive boughs. From our vantage point, the clearing looked small and insignificant, a pitiful stage for the drama about to unfold. But it was the best chance we had. Up here, the Kiyashi would have to come to us, it would have to reveal itself, if only for a moment. And in that moment, we would strike. It was a desperate gamble, the last roll of the dice against an implacable foe, but it was all we had left. I motioned for Chris to take up position on the opposite side of the trunk. Our rifles were trained on the clearing below, and with a last-chance glance that said more than words ever could, we settled into wait. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Around us, the only sound was the mournful sigh of the wind through the branches. Minutes crawled by, each one an eternity unto itself. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves set my nerves jangling like ill-tuned piano wire, and then, as the last of the light bled from the sky, not in a rush of snarling fury, but in a silent glide that seemed to part the very fabric of the world. One moment the clearing was empty, the next it was there. A hulking shape that dwarfed the firs and seemed to drink in the darkness. Even from our perch, I could feel the weight of its presence, the sheer suffocating malevolence that rolled off it in waves. It was like staring into the abyss and feeling it stare back, cruel and cunning and infinitely patient. For a long, airless moment, it simply stood there, its massive head swinging from side to side as if sensing the air. And then, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of centuries of hunting, it looked up directly at us. In that instant, I knew we had made a grave miscalculation. We hadn't forced a confrontation on our terms. We had delivered ourselves to the monster's doorstep, gift-wrapped our terror for its delight. Its eyes, glowing like banked coals in the depths of its shaggy head, seemed to mock us. They promised slow, delicious suffering, and end as savage and pitiless as the forest that birthed the beast. Chris fired first, a panic burst that went wide, rattling the branches around us. I joined him a heartbeat later. My own shots were wild and desperate. It was like spitting into a hurricane, like trying to halt an avalanche with your bare hands. The Kiyashi shrugged off the hits its hide absorbed, as if they were no more than bothersome gnats. And then it gathered itself, muscles bunching beneath its matted fur, and leaped. It hit the tree like a wrecking ball, the impact nearly shaking Chris and me from our perches. Bark exploded around us, splinters flying like shrapnel as the trunk groaned and shuddered. The monster snarled. Its jaws snapped shut, inches from Chris' dangling foot. He yelped and scrambled higher, his eyes wide and rolling in his chalk-white face. I clung to my branch, my rifle locked in a white-knuckled grip, and stared down into the face of my own mortality. The Kiyashi glared back at me, a promise of slow, agonizing dissolution. And in that moment, hanging above the abyss with only heartbeats left to me, I felt something give way inside. Not a breaking, but an opening, like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. The part of me that had always held back, that had flinched from the darkness in my own soul, crumbled like rotted wood. What rose in its place was something colder and harder, something forged in the same pitiless depths that had birthed the Kaishi, a resolve as implacable as the forest itself, as merciless as the oncoming night. I looked into the monster's eyes and saw my own reflection staring back grim and feral and utterly without fear. And I knew with a certainty that went beyond mere flesh and bone that not only one of us would walk away from this clearing. The Kanishi sensed the change, the shift in the air between us. It snarled, deepened, rumbling through the trees like the growl of a coming earthquake. It gathered itself for another lunge, its muscles coiling beneath its shaggy hide. But this time I was ready. This time I didn't flinch or quail. I stared into the heart of the beast and let the darkness in me rise up to meet it. And when it leapt, jaws gaping wide, I leaped to meet it, a wordless howl tearing itself from my throat. We met in midair, hunter and hunted, monster and man. And then we were falling, grappling, snarling. A tangle of fang and fury plummeting towards the unforgiving earth. The world spun dizzyingly, branches in sky and looming shadows whirling together in a mad kaleidoscope. We hit the ground hard. The impact drove the breath from my lungs in a single agonized rush. For a moment I lay there, stunned, my vision swimming with black spots. And then the Kaishi was on me, its bulk pinning me to the forest floor like a moth on a collector's pin. Its jaws snapped shut inches from my face, its breath hot, fetid. It smelled of old blood and rotting meat. I scrabbled at it frantically, my fingers sinking into its shaggy fur, searching for purchase for some kind of weakness. But it was like grappling with a mountain, like trying to shift the very bedrock of the earth. Above me, Chris was shouting something, his voice high and thin with panic. But his words were lost in the thunder of my own heartbeat, and the snarling breaths of the beast that was about to end me. The Kaishi lunged again, its teeth aiming for my throat. And in that moment, my groping fingers found what they were searching for, the hilt of my knife, still sheathed at my belt. I ripped it free, the blade glinted in the fading light. And then, with a final defiant roar, I drove it up and in, burying it to the hilt of the monster's chest. The Kaishi convulsed, shutting down from the point of impact, rippling through its entire frame. For a moment it loomed above me still, its eyes wide and disbelieving. And then it collapsed, its dead weight driving the air from my lungs once more. I lay there, gasping, pinned beneath the bulk of my vanquished foe. My hand was still locked around the knife hilt. I could feel the warm rush of its blood over my fingers. I could hear the fading thunder of its heartbeat. And as the last of the light fled, the sky and shadow rushed in to claim the clearing. I began to laugh, a wild, jagged sound that held no mirth, only a grim awareness of how close I'd come to oblivion. It was over. The hunt, the nightmare, the long, slow dance with an ancient evil. All of it was done, but even as that realization settled over me like a shroud, I knew that something else was just beginning. Because I had started to the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. In that dark communion I had glimpsed the true nature of the forest of the world that lurked beneath the veneer of civilization. I had become a thing of blood and shadow, a creature as pitiless and implacable as the Kaishi itself. As Chris' shouts of concern finally penetrated the fog of my exhaustion, even as I began the long, painful process of digging myself out from under the monster's carcass, I knew that I would never be the same. The forest had marked me, claimed me as one of its own. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how deep I buried myself in the trappings of the human world, I would always feel its call, the dark whisper of the wild in my blood. I'd gone into the forest a man and emerged a monster, and that I knew was a fate. I would carry with me all my days, burdened in a dark blessing that would haunt me until the day I drew my last breath. But for now, in this moment, with the taste of victory still sharp on my tongue and the weight of my dead foes still pressing down on me, I could only close my eyes and let the shadows take me, a final surrender to the darkness that had always been waiting, patient and hungry, in the depths of my soul. The extraction team found us just after dawn. Phalanx of grim-faced men and women in forest camo descended on the clearing like avenging angels. I had to pry my fingers from the knife hilt. They had to physically lift me out from under the coyote's bulk. I let them do it, too drained to resist, too numb to feel anything but a distant, aching relief. Chris hovered at the edges of my vision, his face a mask of concern and barely suppressed questions. But I had no answers for him, no words to explain the dark epiphany that had overtaken me in the heart of the forest. They airlifted the Koyashi's carcass at first, a task that required a heavy-duty cargo net, and a helicopter with oversized rotors. I watched them do it. I watched that hulking shape vanish into the morning mist, and felt a pang of something that might have been regret. It had been a worthy foe in the end, a monster out of primordial nightmare, a dark reflection of everything I had both feared and longed for in the depths of my own soul. To see it reduced to so much lifeless meat, trussed up and carted off like a prize buck, seemed almost obscene. They put me on the second chopper out along with Chris. I didn't protest, I didn't insist on staying to help with the cleanup. I had done my job, fulfilled my purpose. The rest was just details, the grim logistics of tidying up after a battle that had been waged on a level far beyond the merely physical. As we lifted off the wash from the rotors, sending the trees below into a frenzied dance, I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the chaos blood, the knuckles raw and bruised from the struggle. I realized with a dim sense of surprise that they didn't feel like my hands anymore. They felt like someone else, like the hands of a stranger who had done a dark and desperate thing. The flight back to base passed in a blur, the chatter of the extraction team fading into a meaningless buzz. Chris tried to talk to me once or twice, his voice low and urgent over the roar of the engines. But I just shook my head, my gaze fixed on some far horizon. Only I could see what lay before us. What could I say to him? That I had seen the true face of the world and it had looked back at me with pitiless, hungry eyes. That I had become something more and less than human, a creature of blood and shadow and primal instinct. He wouldn't understand, couldn't understand, not unless he'd been there in the heart of the nightmare, grappling with a horror that wore the forest like a second skin. But they debriefed us separately, Chris and I, a precaution that seemed both necessary and futile. What had happened out there, in the green hell of the Tillamook, wasn't something that could be captured in words, in tidy reports and clinical analyses. It was a story written in blood and terror, in the dark poetry of tooth and claw and desperate gasping breath. I told him what I could, the bare bones of the hunt, the stark details of Kayeshu's demise, but I left out the heart of it, the moment when I had stared into the beast's eyes and seen myself reflected back, savage and snarling and utterly, terribly free. I was my secret, my burden and my dark gift. The thing I would carry with me all my days, the shadow that would haunt my steps. No matter how far I ran or how deep I buried myself in the trappings of civilization. They gave me a commendation in the end. A medal, a handshake, and a speech about valor in the face of impossible odds. I stood there and accepted it, the medal cold and heavy against my chest, and felt like a fraud, like an imposter in my own skin. Because the truth was, I hadn't been valiant. I hadn't been brave or noble or any of the things they spoke of in solemn ringing tones. I had been scared, terrified, and in that terror I had touched something dark and primal and utterly ruthless, something that had always been there waiting, lurking just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed persona. The Kaishi had torn away that mask, ripped through the veil of humanity I had worn like a shield. And what had emerged? It wasn't a hero, it wasn't a savior or a champion of the light. It was something older, something fiercer and more feral, a predator born of blood and shadow and the pitiless law of fang and claw. It was my real commendation, the true metal I would wear for the rest of my days. The knowledge that deep down in the secret savage heart of me, I was a monster. And the worst part, the part that woke me in the night, sweating and gasping and reaching for a knife that was no longer there, was that some small dark part of me reveled in it, embraced it, wore it like a badge of honor, because out there in the green hell of the Tillamook, I had been alive in a way I had never been before, alive in tooth and claw, and desperate, snarling breath, alive in the way of the primordial, the way of fang and fury and blood on the leaves. And that dark, fierce joy sang in my veins like a siren song, a call back to the forest, back to the nightmare that had remade me in its own savage image. It was a call I knew I would heed one day. It was a call I would answer with a howl and a snarl and a heart that beat in time with the ancient, pitiless rhythms of the wild. But for now, I would go on. I would wear my human mask, walk my human paths. I'd pretend for a little while longer to be one of them, the civilized, the tamed, the safe. And all the while in the depths of my soul, the forest would wait, patient, hungry, calling me home. I woke with a start, my heart racing in the stillness of my remote Alaskan cabin. Pale dawn light seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I, Jasper Holland, had retreated to this wilderness sanctuary months ago, seeking solitude to finish my latest novel. Formerly the tranquil surroundings, dense forests, and a pristine lake perfect for fishing brought me peace. But this morning an unsettling sensation prickled at the back of my neck. I rose and began my morning routine, trying to shake off the unease. As I sipped my coffee, a knock sounded at the door. It was my neighbor Deirdre Gallater. Her face was ashen. "Jasper, have you heard the news?" Her normally cheerful voice wavered. "They found something awful in that old abandoned cabin in the woods. It's like a scene from a horror movie." Intrigued, I pressed for details, but Deirdre seemed reluctant to say more. My curiosity growing, I decided to investigate myself. I phoned my old friend Archibald Thurman, an avid hiker familiar with the area. Together we set off into the misty forest. The damp earth muffled our footsteps. The abandoned cabin emerged from the fog like an apparition. As we approached, a coppery scent hung heavy in the air. Archie pointed to the door, his hand trembling. Dark stains trailed across the weathered wood. With growing trepidation, we stepped inside. Chaos greeted us. Furniture lay smashed and overturned. Claw marks gouged into the walls. Splatters of a dark, viscous substance painted a gruesome picture of violence. And there, amid the debris, a grisly sight stopped us cold. A human skeleton, bits of ragged flesh still clinging to the bones, splayed across the floor. It appeared to have been gnawed upon by some savage creature. Archie, his face pale, recounted a local legend in a hushed whisper. Rumors of a beast, an unnatural predator that roamed these woods. The creature never captured on film or confirmed by hunter sightings. Could this macabre scene be its handiwork? Driven by a dangerous curiosity, we resolved to uncover the truth. But first we needed an expert. Maynard Beeford, a seasoned tracker, lived on the outskirts of town. With his skills, perhaps we could piece together this dark puzzle. We made a pact, Archie and I. We would leave behind our safe, ordinary lives to pursue this mystery no matter the cost. But as we stepped back into the sunlight, a shiver raced down my spine. The forest that had once seemed a sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. What secrets did it hold in its shadowy depths, and were we truly prepared to face them? Daylight was fading by the time we reached Maynard's rustic homestead. We found him on his porch whittling a piece of wood, his weathered face creased in concentration. He listened intently as we recounted our grim discovery, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the rumored beast. "I've heard stories," he said, his voice low and grave. Whispers passed down through generation. A creature that defies description, stalking the deepest parts of the forest. He leaned forward, fixing us with a piercing stare. If it's royal, if this is indeed its work, you boys best be careful. This is no ordinary animal. With Maynard's warning ringing in our ears, we made our preparation. We gathered supplies, camping gear, weapons, traps, and anything that might aid our hunt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we ventured back into the woods under a canopy of stars. Our first night was a symphony of unsettling noises, the hooting of an owl, the skittering of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Each sound set my nerves on edge. We huddled around our meager campfire, jumping at every snapping twig. When dawn broke, we began our search in earnest, scouring the forest for signs of the creature's passage. It wasn't long before we found them. Broken branches, tufts of coarse hair snagged on bark, and then more disturbing deep gouges in tree trunks far larger than any bear's claws could make. Scattered remnants of tattered clothing, scraps of faded photographs, eerie totems marking the beast's territory. As we trekked deeper into the wilderness, we heard stories from locals that chilled our blood, tales of bone-chilling howls echoing through the night and livestock vanishing without a trace. Gradually, a pattern emerged. The attack seemed to center around the abandoned cabin, as though the beast was drawn to that macabre site. Yet for all the signs of its presence, the creature itself remained elusive, always a step ahead of us. Frustration mounting, we redoubled our efforts. We set traps, rigged cameras, took shifts, standing guard through long nights. But the beast seemed to mock our efforts, leaving grisly remains for us to find each morning. On the fifth night, exhaustion overtook us. We let our guard down just for a moment. That was all it took. A crash in the underbrush jolted me awake, my heart pounding. I turned to rouse the others and froze. A pair of luminous eyes stared back at me from the darkness, eerily intelligent, and quick as a shadow they were gone. Sleep eluded us after that. We waited, weapons clutched tight, barely daring to breathe. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten, we emerged from our uneasy shelter, only to find a scene of unimaginable horror. A body lay in a clearing, a man, his limbs splayed at unnatural angles. Claw marks crisscrossed his chest and throat so deep that the white of bone showed through their tattered edges. His face, what was left of it, frozen in a rictus of terror. We recognized him as Derek Foster, a local man who had gone missing weeks earlier. Finding him like this, savaged and discarded like a broken doll, sent icy tendrils of fear down my spine. The creature had struck close to home. Cruelly, Maynard examined the corpse for clues. Embedded in one of the gaping wounds, he found a tuft of coarse, dark fur matted with congealed blood. The creature had left a piece of itself behind. Archie carefully collected the gruesome evidence, his hands trembling. A grim silence settled over our camp as the weight of our discovery sank in. This was no mere animal we hunted. No natural predator could inflict such calculated brutality. We're not dealing with something of this world, Maynard said softly. His eyes haunted. Old stories speak of a being not quite human, not quite beast. A creature of nightmare that feeds on terror as much as flesh. Hearing our unflappable guide give voice to the dark suspicion growing in my own mind sent a chill through me. What chance did we stand against something that defied the very laws of nature? Yet, even as doubts gnawed at my resolve, a cold fury rose to eclipse my fear. This thing, this twisted abomination, had shed innocent blood. It had to be stopped, whatever the cost. We broke camp with a new sense of urgency, no longer merely hunting but stalking our quarry in turn. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow took on an ominous edge. My senses strained for a glimpse of luminous eyes, a flash of dark fur. That night we didn't dare light a fire, huddling close in the choking darkness. My mind raced, conjuring monstrous visions of what lurked beyond our feeble circle of torchlight. At some point I must have drifted into an uneasy doze, for I woke with a start to a sound that turned my blood to ice. A scream, high and wavering, abruptly cut short. Then a silence more terrible than any sound. Besides me, Archie and Maynard were already on their feet, weapons drawn. That came from the direction of the old cabin, Maynard said grimly. We charged through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that tore at our skin. The cabin loomed before us, a black silhouette against the star-studded sky. At first glance, all seemed still. As my eyes adjusted, I glimpsed a darker shape crouched and feeding at the tray line. No, not huddled. Crouched, feeding. A wave of nausea rose in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The creature, its muzzle buried in the belly of some fresh kill. Time seemed to slow as it raised its head, luminous eyes locking onto mine. In that instant I knew two things with terrifying certainty. We had found the beast, and it had been waiting for us. The creature rose slowly, blood dripping from its maw, and was larger than I'd imagined, muscles rippling beneath its matted fur. As it stepped into a shaft of moonlight, I saw its face clearly for the first time. A twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, its eyes glittering with feral intelligence. Beside me, I heard the click of a gun being cocked. Archie, his hands trembling, leveled his rifle at the beast. It regarded him almost casually, as though the weapon were nothing more than a child's toy. Then, with speed that defied logic, it charged. Archie's shot went wide, the bullet burying itself in a tree trunk. The creature was on him before he could fire again, a blur of teeth and claws. His scream cut through me like a knife. I raised my own gun, but hesitated. Fear and revulsion warring with the need to act. In that moment of indecision, Maynard leaped forward, an inhuman roar tearing from his throat. I barreled into the creature, knocking it away from Archie's prone form. The two titans clashed in a whirlwind of snarls and flashing fangs, despite Maynard's prodigious strength. It quickly became clear he was outmatched. The beast moved with fluid grace, seeming to anticipate his every attack. I watched in horror as razor-sharp claws raked across Maynard's chest, sending him staggering back. Blood bloomed on his shirt, black in the moonlight. The creature crouched, preparing to spring and deliver the killing blow. Desperation overrode my paralysis. I charged forward, firing wildly, hoping to distract the beast to buy Maynard a precious few seconds. To my shock, one of my shots found its mark, striking the creature's shoulder. It reeled back with a high-pitched cry, piercing the night. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. And in that moment, I saw something that chilled me more than its savagery. Intelligence, cruel and calculating, and something else. Something disturbingly akin to amusement, as though this were all some twisted game. And then it was gone, melting into the shadows as though it had never been. Shaking, I rushed to Maynard's side. His wounds were deep, but thankfully not fatal. Archie was less fortunate. The beast's claws had laid open his throat, his lifeblood staining the earth. Numb with shock and grief, we carried his body back to the cabin. We had set out to uncover a mystery, to stop a creature of nightmare. Instead, we had paid a blood price, and the beast was still out there waiting. As we tended our wounds, a heavy silence fell. The weight of our folly, of the horrors we'd witnessed, pressed down like a physical thing. Finally, Maynard spoke, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "We're in over our heads," he said. "This thing is beyond us. We need to get out of here. Get help." I wanted to argue, to insist that we couldn't abandon our hunt. On one look at Archie's lifeless face, at the shadows haunting Maynard's eyes, and I knew he was right. This was a battle we couldn't win. Not alone. With heavy hearts, we made our preparations to leave, to seek aid and regroup. But even as we packed our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was out there watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. Deep down, I knew this was far from over. Dawn was breaking as we emerged from the woods, the first golden rays of sunlight doing little to chase away the shadows clinging to our souls. Each step was an effort, our bodies battered, our minds reeling from the horrors we'd witnessed. We made our way to the nearest ranger station, a small, unassuming building that suddenly felt like a bastion of normalcy in a world gone mad. A ranger on duty, a grizzled man named John, listened to our tale with growing disbelief and concern. "You're lucky to be alive," he said grimly, shaking his head. "I've heard stories about that cabin, about strange happenings in those woods, but nothing like this." He radioed for backup, his voice tight with urgency. Within hours, the station was swarming with activity. Police, wildlife officials, even a team of specialists flown in from the city. They pored over our evidence, the grisly photos and Maynard's wounded testimony, painting a picture almost too strange to believe. And yet, for all the resources brought to bear, the creature seemed to have vanished like smoke. Search parties combed the woods but found no trace of the beast. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed it whole. As the days stretched into weeks, the official investigation began to lose steam. Theories were put forth: an uncommonly large bear perhaps, or a pack of wolves driven to boldness by hunger. The evidence of the creature's unnatural nature was quietly swept aside, explained away, but Maynard and I knew the truth. We'd seen the intelligence in those glowing eyes, felt the weight of its malevolent presence, and armed with the bone-deep certainty that it was still out there. In the end, the cabin was torn down, the site cordoned off and declared off-limits. Archie's death was ruled an animal attack. His body was laid to rest with heroes' honors. Life, as it always does, moved on, but for Maynard and I, there could be no going back. We never changed, haunted by the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows of the world. The creature had marked us in ways both seen and unseen. I returned to my own cabin, but found no peace there. And every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees set my heart racing. I knew deep in my marrow that I would never feel truly safe again. Maynard and I still meet, sometimes sharing a drink and memories of the friend we lost. We don't talk much about that night, about the scars we both bear, but it's there in the silence between us, a bond forged in blood and terror. And sometimes in the deepest watches of the night, awake in a cold sweat, the echo of a howl ringing in my ears. In those moments I'll remember luminous eyes watching from the darkness, and I'll wonder if the creature is still out there stalking the shadows of the forest. Wonder if our paths will cross again in some final fateful confrontation. In the end, there are no easy answers, no tidy resolutions. Only the knowledge that the world is vaster and stranger than we ever dared to imagine. And that sometimes the monsters of our nightmares are all too real. That is the legacy of our hunt. The burden Maynard and I will carry for the rest of our days. A secret, we could never share a truth too terrible to face. But in each other we have found a measure of solace and understanding that needs no words. For in the end, perhaps that is all we can ask for. Not a happy ending, but the strength to endure, to keep living in a world forever changed by the touch of the unknown. And the knowledge that, whatever horrors may lurk in the shadows, we do not face them alone. My name is Ethan Reeves. I'm 32 years old and grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. I've always loved the outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, you name it. There's something peaceful about being immersed in nature, surrounded by towering pines and the chatter of wildlife. After graduating college with an environmental science degree and a significant amount of student debt, I struggled to find steady work. Months of job applications yielded nothing but rejections. Money was tight, and I was feeling desperate. That's when I stumbled across a job listing for a park ranger position in the remote wilderness of Oregon's Umpqua National Forest. The pay was modest, but it included housing, and most importantly, it was a chance to do what I love. I submitted my application, not expecting much, but to my surprise, I got a call 2 weeks later from the park superintendent, an older gentleman named Walter Briggs. He had a kind but weathered voice, the sound of someone who had spent a lifetime in the woods. "Your credentials are impressive, son," Walter said. "We'd be lucky to have you join our team out here. When can you start?" I accepted on the spot, elated at the opportunity. I packed my immediate belongings into my old Subaru and made the long drive from Michigan to Oregon, eager to begin this new chapter. The Umpqua National Forest was even more stunning than I had imagined. Miles of pristine rivers and streams carved through old growth, Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Steep ridges and lush valleys extended as far as the eye could see. It felt like a paradise, untouched by man. I met Walter at the ranger station, a rustic wooden building nestled at the edge of the forest. He was a stout man in his 60s with kind eyes and a scruffy gray beard. He greeted me with a firm handshake. "Welcome to the Umpqua, Ethan," he said with a smile. "Let me show you to your cabin. I think you're really gonna like it out here." He led me down a winding dirt path deeper into the woods until we reached a small log cabin. It was quaint but well maintained, with a covered porch and stone chimney. "It's perfect," I said appreciatively. "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity, Walter. We're happy to have you, son. Get yourself settled and we'll talk more in the morning about your ranger duties. And there's a lot of ground to cover out here." Walter bid me good night, and I carried my bags inside the cozy cabin. As I unpacked, a profound sense of peace washed over me. After months of worry and uncertainty, things were finally looking up. I had a purpose, a direction. Little did I know it would be the start of the most terrifying experience of my life. My first few weeks as a park ranger flew by in a flurry of training and orientation. Walter showed me the ropes, teaching me how to navigate the dense wilderness, basic first aid and survival skills, operating the park radios, and interacting with visitors. I shadowed him and the other experienced rangers, trying to learn as much as I could. The job was demanding, but incredibly fulfilling. Each morning, I'd rise with the sun, make a thermos of strong coffee, and head out into the misty forest for my patrol. I'd hike the winding trails, ensuring they were clear of debris and well-marked for hikers. I monitored the campsites, checked permits, and kept an eye out for any signs of trouble. Occasionally, I'd stop and chat with backpackers, offering recommendations on the best fishing spots or vista points. But my favorite part of the day was the late afternoon when the crowds thinned and a hushed stillness fell over the woods. I'd climb to one of the high ridges and watch the golden sun dip below the sea of evergreens, listening to the faint bird song and the whisper of the wind. In those perfect, tranquil moments, I felt a deep sense of belonging, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As I settled into my new routine, I got to know my fellow rangers better. There was Mike Walters, a burly ex-Marine in his 40s who worked in the Umpqua for over a decade. He had a dry sense of humor and an endless supply of wild backcountry stories. And Jen Carver, a spunky ranger in her late 20s who'd grown up in the area and knew the forest like the back of her hand. We formed a close-knit team, looking out for each other in the isolated wilderness. One evening, after a long day of trail maintenance, Mike and I were sitting on the porch of my cabin, sipping beers and swapping tales. The sun had set, and the forest was alive with the chatter of crickets and frogs. I took a long pull of his beer and glanced out at the shadowy tree line. "You know, Ethan," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "Walter's a good man and he runs a tight ship around here. But there are some things about this forest that he doesn't like to talk about." I looked at him quizzically, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mike hesitated, as if carefully considering his next words. "This is an old forest with a long history. The local tribes have stories, legends about dark things in these woods, things that predate man walking this earth. A chill crept up my spine despite the warm evening air. What kind of things? It's hard to explain. Strange creatures, dark forces, spirits of the forest. Most of it's just talk, campfire tales. But over the years there have been some disappearances, some incidents that don't quite add up. He must have seen the unease on my face because he quickly added, I wouldn't worry about it too much though. As long as you stick to protocol and don't go wandering off trail alone, you'll be fine. We all look out for each other out here. I nodded, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Mike was right. They were probably just old legends, scary stories to tell around the campfire. Still, as I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the eerie rustling of the wind in the trees, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets this ancient forest held. As summer faded into fall, the flow of visitors to the Umpqua began to slow. The vibrant wildflowers withered, and the lush ferns grew brittle in the crisp autumn air. I watched the forest transform into a sea of amber and gold almost overnight, with fewer campers and hikers to tend to. Our ranger duties shifted to focus on prepping the park for the winter season. We cleared fallen trees, repaired damaged structures, and battened down the hatches before the heavy rains and snows arrived. I had grown to love this wild and rugged landscape, but as the days grew shorter, I couldn't shake an inexplicable sense of unease. The towering firs creaked and groaned in the biting wind. Their ancient branches reached out like gnarled fingers. The mournful cries of a raven reverberated through the desolate hollows. The forest itself seemed to be bracing for something, holding its breath. One chilly October morning, I headed out at first light to survey a remote section at the northern edge of the forest. A heavy mist clung to the moss-covered floor and swirled around the massive trunks. An ethereal stillness hung in the air. The usual chatter of birds and insects was conspicuously absent. The only sound was the soft crunch of my boots on the rocky trail. I had been hiking for about an hour when I came across a small meadow. A break in the dense tree line. In the center was an ancient hemlock, its trunk thick and gnarled with age. As I approached, I noticed markings etched into the weathered bark, intricate symbols and pictograms unlike anything I had ever seen. They seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy, making my skin crawl. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around to see the silhouette of a massive creature lumbering into the misty shadows of the forest. It moved with a strange gait, too fluid to be a bear, too large to be a coyote. A wave of primal dread washed over me. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the creature vanished back into the enveloping mists. The forest fell still once more, leaving me questioning if I had actually seen something or if it had merely been a figment of my overactive imagination. I looked back to the ancient hemlock, but the strange symbols were gone, the bark unblemished. With a mounting sense of trepidation, I hurried back to the ranger station. I burst through the doors, causing Jen to jump in alarm. She took one look at my ashen face and furrowed her brow with concern. Ethan, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I shook my head, trying to collect my thoughts. I'm not sure. Something strange happened out there. I think I saw something. I recounted my unsettling encounter to Jen, watching her eyes grow wide. When I mentioned the symbols on the tree, she frowned. Those sound like native markings, probably old Umpqua tribe drawings, she said. As for the creature, it was probably just a bear or an elk. The mist can play tricks on your eyes out there. I nodded half-heartedly, wanting to believe her rational explanation, but unable to shake the visceral dread I had felt in that meadow. What I had seen was no bear. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. As I tried to focus on my work the rest of the day, my mind kept drifting back to Mike's ominous warning about the forest's dark history and the ancient native legends. For the first time since arriving in the Umpqua, I felt a deep chill of fear taking root in my heart. Something told me this was only the beginning, harbinger of horrors to come. In the days following my unsettling encounter in the North Woods, I tried to throw myself into my ranger duties with renewed focus. I convinced myself that the creature had been nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination and too many campfire ghost stories. The strange symbols on the ancient tree were surely just old tribal markings, their meaning lost to time. But as much as I tried to rationalize it away, annoying unease continued to grow inside me like a spreading fungus. I became increasingly jumpier and more on edge. The once comforting whisper of the wind in the fur now sounded more like ominous murmurs. Shadows seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I wasn't the only one who noticed the change in atmosphere. Mike, usually jovial and unflappable, grew more taciturn, his brow perpetually furrowed. Even Jen seemed affected, her normally bright smile had diminished. One evening, we all gathered in the ranger station, seeking refuge from an unseasonal chill that had settled over the forest. We huddled around the crackling wood stove, sipping hot coffee and listening to the wind rattle the old window panes. Mike cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been hearing some strange reports from hikers lately," he said. "People saying they've seen things out in the woods, things that shouldn't be there." Jen and I exchanged a glance. "What kind of things?" she asked. Shadow figures darting between the trees, eerie lights in the night sky, inhuman screeches echoing through the canyons. Mike's face was grim, and the disappearances have started again. A heavy silence fell over the room. We're all aware of the Umpqua's dark history of unexplained disappearances, but we seldom spoke of it. "Or disappearances?" I asked, a knot forming in my gut. Mike sighed heavily. A young couple went missing from their campsite near Turkini Falls last week, just vanished, leaving all their gear behind. The search parties found no trace of them, and they're not the first this season. Jen shook her head. Those falls have always been a hotspot for accidents. They probably just got swept downriver. But there was uncertainty in her voice. We all knew the truth. People didn't just vanish without a trace. Not like this. I thought back to the markings I'd seen on the ancient tree and the hulking creature in the mist. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the biting cold outside. "There's something out there," I said quietly. "Something not right." Mike met my gaze. His eyes were shadowed. The native legends speak of dark spirits that inhabit this forest. Malevolent entities older than man. They say that every few decades, when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, these spirits come through to feed on the life force of the living. A heavy pall fell over the room as we each grappled with the unnatural implications. The wind continued to howl mournfully outside, creaking and groaning as if in agonized agreement. That night in my cabin, I tossed and turned fitfully, my sleep plagued by nightmares. I saw twisted inhuman shapes slithering through the misty understory of the forest. Their forms were grotesque and ever-shifting. I heard agonized screams, and smelled the cloying scent of damp loam and rotting flesh. And through it all, a constant droning chant in some long-forgotten language filled my skull and made my sanity feel like a thin, fragile veneer. When I awoke just before dawn in a cold sweat, I knew the truth with a grim certainty that settled into my marrow. We were no longer just rangers tasked with protecting the forest and its visitors. We were standing at the precipice of an ancient, malevolent horror, and it was rising to devour us all. Next morning, I woke feeling anything but rested. The nightmares clung to me like a second skin, leaving me unsettled and anxious. I forced down a quick breakfast and headed out into the misty pre-dawn to start my patrol, hoping the crisp autumn air would clear my head. As I hiked along one of the lesser-used trails near the western edge of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat gathered between my shoulder blades. Despite the chill, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch my hand, instinctively going for the reassuring weight of the bear spray on my belt. I was about to radio back to the station and request a check-in when a sudden piercing scream ripped through the still morning air. It was a sound of pure primal terror that made my blood run cold. It seemed to be coming from up ahead on the trail. Heart hammering, and I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush towards the source of the scream. I bust into a small clearing and stopped dead at the scene before me. A woman lay crumpled at the base of a towering spruce. Her hiking pack was cast to the side. She was unnaturally still, her pale eyes staring blankly at the gray sky above. Standing over her was a dark, hulking figure, easily 8 feet tall. Its form seemed to shift and undulate, never quite taking on a solid shape. Oily tendrils of shadow whipped around it like a living aura. As I watched in horror, the creature reached down with a gnarled, talon-like hand and pressed it against the woman's chest. A sickly green glow emanated from the point of contact, pulsing like a heartbeat. The woman's body began to wither before my eyes, her skin growing ashen and brittle, her cheeks sinking in until she was little more than a desiccated husk. The creature lifted its head, regarding me with glowing, malevolent eyes that held an ancient hunger. I felt that gaze pierce me to my core, filleting my soul. An icy dread, unlike anything I had ever known, filled me, locking my muscles in place. Suddenly, a shout shattered the trance. "Ethan, get down!" I dropped to the ground instinctively as a shot rang out. The creature jerked a high-pitched shriek, rending the air. I looked up to see Mike standing at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised. He fired again, and the creature stumbled back, shadow flesh sizzling where the bullets tore through. With an unearthly roar, the entity rose up to its full height, shadows lashing out like whips. Mike darted back into the tree line just as a bolt of sizzling darkness crackled through the space where his head had been a second before. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted towards Mike, the creature's furious howls dogging my heels. We crashed through the woods, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. Finally, we burst out onto one of the main trails, gasping for breath. The forest behind us was deathly silent once more, with no trace of the nightmare we had just witnessed. Mike and I looked at each other, the horror of what we had seen reflected in each other's eyes. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. What the hell was that thing? I managed between ragged breaths. Mike shook his head grimly. Something that shouldn't exist. Something old and evil. He safeguarded his rifle and slung it over his shoulder, glancing warily back at the tree line. "We need to get back to the station and call this in. That woman, there was nothing natural about what happened to her." A wave of nausea rolled through me as I recalled the way the creature had drained the life from her, leaving nothing but a withered husk. The memory of its malevolent gaze boring into me made my skin crawl. We set off down the trail at a quick clip, keen to put as much distance between us and those shattered woods. My mind churned with questions and a creeping existential dread. What other horrors were lurking in this forest, waiting to be unleashed? How were we supposed to stop something that defied the laws of nature? As we neared the ranger station, a crackling voice came over our radios. It was Jen, and there was a note of barely restrained panic in her tone. "Mike, come in. We have a situation developing." We exchanged a worried look, and Mike grabbed his handset. "Go ahead, Jen. What's happening?" Reports are flooding in from all over the park about sightings of strange creatures, shadowy figures stalking hikers, inhuman shapes glimpsed between the trees. A group just came in claiming they were attacked by something near Lamolo Lake. Guys, I think this is only the beginning. The grim silence fell as the scale of what we were facing sank in. This wasn't an isolated incident. An ancient evil was stirring in the depths of the forest, and it was growing bolder, hungrier. As we reached the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were woefully unprepared for the coming storm. We were just park rangers, guardians of the forest, trained to deal with unruly campers and the occasional bear. Not ambient abominations from beyond the veil of time. As I looked at the determined set of Mike's jaw and the fierce glint in Jen's eye, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was out there, we would face it together. For this was our forest, and we would not let the darkness claim it without a fight. The ranger station was a flurry of activity, phones ringing off the hook and radio chatter constant. Rangers rushed about, their faces tight with stress and fear. Jen met us at the door, her expression grave. "It's happening all over the park," she said, leading us inside. "Whatever these things are, they're not staying hidden anymore. We've got multiple missing persons reports, dozens of sightings." She handed us a map of the forest marked with red pins denoting the locations of strange encounters. The pins were concentrated around the most remote, rarely traveled sections of the park. Walter emerged from his office looking haggard and older than I had ever seen him. He gathered us around the map, his voice heavy with worry. "I've been on the line with the Forest Service and local law enforcement," he said. "They send me backup and resources, but it's going to take time to mobilize a response on this scale. Until then, it's on us to hold the line and protect the civilians." He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze resolute, despite the fear lurking in his eyes. "I won't lie to you," he said. "This is unlike anything we've ever faced before, but you are some of the finest rangers I've had the privilege to serve with. If anyone can get our people through this, it's you." The somber silence fell over the room as the enormity of our task sank in. We were the first and last line of defense against an unholy threat we barely understood. Meg spoke up, his voice steady. "What's our play, Chief? How do we even begin to combat these things?" Walter tapped the map indicating the areas of highest activity. "We establish a perimeter around these hotspots, pull back as many hikers and campers as we can, and consolidate them in the designated emergency shelters and secure the areas." He looked to Jen. "Coordinate with the campground hosts. Make sure they have an accurate head count of everyone in their sites. Any unaccounted for, we assume are still out there and in danger." Jen nodded sharply and headed off, already pulling out her radio to relay instructions. Walter turns to Mike and me. "You two are our best trackers and woodsmen. I need you to head back out there, search these hotspots for any signs of the missing or injured. But your top priority is to stay safe and avoid direct confrontation with these entities if at all possible. We still don't know what we're dealing with or how to effectively fight them." I met Mike's eyes, seeing my own trepidation reflected back, but beneath it was a steely determination, a resolve to face whatever horrors lay ahead. We geared up quickly, supplementing our usual kit with additional first aid supplies, flares, and more powerful weapons from the ranger station's emergency cache. As I slipped additional rounds into my rifle's magazine, I couldn't help but feel a grim irony. All my life I had sought solace in the untamed beauty of the wilderness, and now that very wilderness had become a hunting ground for nightmares made flesh. Before we departed, Walter pulled us aside. In his weathered face, I saw the weight of his years, the burden of responsibility for the lives of his care. "I've worked these woods for over 3 decades, he said solemnly, seeing things I can't rightly explain. There's an old power in this forest, something ancient and not entirely of this world. I always hoped I'd never see it wake up angry." He clasped our shoulders, his grip fierce with urgency. "But mark my words, this is our land, our forest, and we will not abandon it to the dark without a reckoning. May God watch over you boys out there." With a final nod, Mike and I stepped out into the gathering dusk. The lengthening shadows of the tree line beckoned a sinister invitation. As we melted into the underbrush, weapons at the ready, I sent a prayer into the uncaring sky above. Not for deliverance, but for strength to face the long night ahead and whatever lost souls we might find in its eldritch depths. The forest had transformed with the falling darkness as if donning a veil of malevolence. The familiar paths and landmarks I'd walked 100 times now felt outright hostile, pregnant with unseen menace. Every dancing shadow and creaking branch harbored threats. My mind conjured phantoms in the gloom. Mike and I moved cautiously through the brush, senses straining. We had decided to start our search near the Mullow Lake, where the last recorded sighting had been before all hell broke loose. The bombs from our high-power flashlights carved anemic tunnels through the misty air as we scanned for any signs of the lost or injured. A part of me almost wished we wouldn't find anyone. The memory of what that dark entity had done to the hiker was still fresh, replaying behind my eyelids with every blink, the horror of her life essence being drained. I didn't know if I had the strength to witness such a thing again. Suddenly, Mike held up a fist, halting us. He nodded towards a dense copse ahead, where there caught in the quivering beam of his light was a still form sprawled across the loam. We approached warily, rifles at the ready. As we drew closer, the figure resolved into a man in tattered hiking gear. He lay face down, limbs splayed at unnatural angle. My courage rose as I saw the ash and pallor of his skin, the way it had sunk in against his bones like parchment. Mike crouched by the body checking for vitals, but I knew it was futile. No one can survive having their life force ripped out like that. He's gone, Mike said grimly, probably been dead for hours based on the state of him. I swallowed back bile, my grip tightening on my rifle. Just like the woman from before, these things are feeding on people, Mike and I hunting them. A rustling in the underbrush nearby snapped us to high alert. We swung our lights towards the source, fingers hovering over triggers. For a tense moment, there was only the hiss of our breath and the hammering of blood in our ears. Then a figure stumbled out from behind a tree. It was a young man, his face ashen and eyes wide with terror. He stared at us for a beat, trembling before recognition dawned. "Oh, thank God," he choked out, staggering towards us. "Rangers, please. You have to help me." It took my girlfriend. He broke down into sobs, collapsing to his knees. Mike and I rushed over, training our lights on the surrounding woods as we tried to calm him. "Easy there, son," Mike said, laying a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now. Tell us what happened. What took your girlfriend?" The young man looked up at us, his face a mask of haunted anguish. I don't know what it was. We were setting up camp near the lake when we heard this sound like a howling wind, but wrong. Then it came out of the trees, this thing of shadows and darkness. He shuddered, his voice cracking. It moved so fast it grabbed Jenna and just started draining her. I could see the life being pulled out of her, like it was feeding on her soul. I tried to stop it, but it just swatted me aside like I was nothing. I ran. Oh God, I left her. He dissolved into fresh sobs, racked with guilt and trauma. My heart ached for him, even as a renewed dread settled in my gut. We were outmatched here up against forces we barely understood. Mike met my gaze over the young man's bowed head, and I read the same grim realization in his eyes. We had to get this survivor to safety and regroup with the others. Trying to take on these things without backup or a plan was suicide. We hauled the shell-shocked hiker to his feet, supporting his weight between us. As we made our way back through the eldritch night towards the distant lights of the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of baleful, inhuman eyes tracking our every move from the Stygian depths of the forest. Something ancient and hungry had awoken in the unquiet and was far from done feeding. From the time we stumbled into the ranger station, half carrying the traumatized hiker, the true scale of the unfolding catastrophe had become gruesomely clear. Dozens of injured and terrified campers huddled in the main hall, many bearing the marks of their own close encounters with the eldritch horrors stalking the woods. We passed the young man off to Jen, who immediately set about tending to his wounds in shock. Mike and I pushed our way through the throng to where Walter was holding court, looking more grim and careworn than I had ever seen him. "Report," he barked as we approached, though his eyes held a sorrowful understanding. "It's bad out there, Chief," Mike said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and strain. "These things are hunting people, draining them. We found a body out by Lamolo Lake, and the survivor we brought in says he watched his girlfriend get taken." Walter closed his eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing a physical blow. When he opened them again, they were hard with resolve. "The Forest Service and local law enforcement are still hours away. We can't wait for them. We need to act now. Get as many people as we can to safety and contain this threat." He spread a map on the table, jabbing his finger at a spot deep in the heart of the wilderness. "There's an old ranger outpost here, abandoned since the 1960s. It's remote and defensible. We load up everyone we can and make a run for it. Hold up there until backup arrives." It was a desperate plan, but what choice did we have? To stay here was to invite a massacre, and trying to hike out en masse would only make us a smorgasbord for the hungry shadows. We leapt into action, marshaling the shell-shocked survivors and loading them into every vehicle we could muster. I watched rangers I had known for months, laughing and joking over morning coffee, grimly pass out weapons and supplies as if preparing for war, and in a way I supposed we were. As the convoy trundled out into the night, its headlights stabbing feebly at the clinging mist, I couldn't shake the sense of being a mouse scurrying from the owl's talons. The forest pressed in from all sides, alive with whispers and threats. Half glimpsed, every fiber of my being screamed to floor the accelerator to outrun the gathering doom. But the winding mountain roads constrained our speed to a slow crawl. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder about the native legends Mike had recounted. How long had these entities stalked the Umpqua, feeding on unfortunate souls every few decades? And what hubris had we shown, thinking we could tame this ancient wood without consequence? Perhaps it was never our forest after all. We were 10 miles out from the old ranger outpost when they struck a shimmer of unlight in the mist. A flicker of motion in the tree line, and suddenly the lit car was tumbling end over end, ripped from the road by forces unseen. Inhuman shrieks filled the air, drowning out the cries of the wounded and my own hammering heartbeat. "Go, go, go." Walter yelled over the radio as shadowy figures boiled out of the darkness, descending on the stricken vehicle like piranhas frenzying on a fresh kill. I slammed the accelerator to the floor, fighting to keep control as we fishtailed around the mangled wreckage. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creatures, their forms an ever-shifting cacophony of angles and darkness. Before we plunged around a bend and they were lost from view, the rest of the journey passed in a harrowing blur of clenched teeth and white knuckles. By the time we skidded into the gravel lot of the abandoned outpost, only 3 vehicles remained of our original 10. The headlights strafed across the sagging cabin, its weathered timbers and dusty windows offering a frail bastion against the encroaching night. We piled out, ushering the terrified survivors inside. Mike and Jen took up defensive positions by the shattered windows, while Walter and I laid salt lines and protective wards cobbled together from half-remembered folklore and desperation. As I poured the last of the salt across the threshold, a sense of dreadful finality settled in my chest. This was our last stand. In the face of an implacable, incomprehensible enemy, we would make our defiance count for something, even if no one lived to remember it. I looked at the drawn, determined faces of my fellow rangers, at the huddled civilians clutching each other in the shadows. These were my people, my family, and I would die before I let the darkness take them. Outside, the mist churned and roiled, as if alive, the shrieks and howls of the hunting horrors drawing ever closer. The long night stretched before us, heavy with promise and dread. The uncle had awoken hungry, and there in that lonely cabin, with shadows cloaking the land and eldritch evil beating at the door, we prepared to feed it our fury and fire one last time.